Section 11 of Outwitting Our Nerves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Belinda McReynolds. Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury. Chapter 11. In which we relearn an old trick, the bugaboo of constipation. Popular superstitions. In line with the taboos connected with the taking of food are the ceremonials attendant upon its elimination. Taking anxious thought about functions well established by nature is a feature of conversion hysteria, the displacement of emotional desire from its psychic realm into symbolic physical expression. Whatever other symptoms nervous people may manifest, they are almost sure to be troubled with chronic constipation. It is true that there are many constipated people who do not seem to be nervous and who resent being classed among the neurotics. Everybody knows that the occasional individual who has difficulty in swallowing his food is nervous, and that the trouble lies not in the muscles of his throat, but in the ideas of his mind. But very few people seem to realize that the more common individual who makes hard work of that other simple process, elimination of his intestinal waste matter, is suffering from the same kind of disturbance and giving way to a nervous trick. When all the facts are in, the constipated person will have hard work to clear himself of at least one count on the charge of nerves. An oft-told tale. Sooner or later, then, the neurotic, whether he calls himself a neurotic or not, is very likely to begin worrying over his diet or his sedentary occupation. He imagines himself the victim of auto-intoxication, afflicted with paralysis of the colon or dearth of intestinal secretions. He leaves off eating white bread, berries, cheese, chocolate, and many another innocent food, and insists on a diet of bran biscuit, flaxseed breakfast foods, prunes, spinach, cream, and olive oil, with doses of mineral oil between meals. In all probability, he begins a course of massage, or he starts to take extra long walks and to exercise night and morning, pulling his knees up to his chin and touching his fingers to his toes. When all these measures fail, he gives in to the morning enema or the nightly pill in imminent danger of succumbing to a lifelong habit. The truth about constipation. What the colon is for. It is well, then, to have a fair understanding of the structure and purpose of our intestinal machinery. Contrary to general opinion, the intestines are not a dumping ground, but a digestive organ. After the food is partly digested in the stomach, it passes through a 22-foot tube, the small intestine, into a 5-foot tube, the large intestine or colon, where digestion is completed, the nutriment is absorbed, and the waste matter is passed on and out through the rectum. As the food passes along the colon, pushed slowly ahead by the peristaltic wave or rhythmic muscular contractions of the intestinal wall, it is seized upon by the 400 varieties of friendly bacteria which inhabit the intestines of every healthy person, and is changed into a form which the body can assimilate. Digestion in the stomach and small intestine is carried on by means of certain digestive juices, but in the large intestine it is the bacteria which do the work. Without them, we could not live. Around the colon is a thick network of little blood vessels, all of which lead straight to the liver, the storehouse of the body. After the food is fully digested, it is passed through the thin intestinal wall into these tiny vessels and carried away to liver and muscles for storage or for immediate use. This process of absorption is carried on throughout the whole length of the colon. Not until the very end of the intestine is reached is all the nutrition abstracted. The bowel content can properly be called waste matter only after it has reached the rectum or pouch at the lower end of the colon. Even then, this waste matter is not poison, but merely indigestible material which the body cannot handle. Food, not poison. The colon is not a cesspool, but a digestive and assimilating organ. Its content is not poison, but food. Active elimination is important, not so much because delay causes auto-intoxication or poisoning, as because too large a mass is hard to manage and irritates the intestinal wall. The problem is not so much one of toxicology as of simple mechanics. If nature had put within the body 5 feet of tubing which could easily become a cesspool and a breeder of poison, it is not at all likely that she would have laid alongside an elaborate system of blood vessels leading not out to the kidneys but into the storehouse of the liver. And if civilized man's changed manner of living has so upset nature's plans as easily to transform his internal machinery into a chronic source of danger, we may be sure that he would long ago have gone the way of the unfit and succumbed to his own poisons. Possible invasions. It is true that the intestinal tract, like the rest of the body, is open to attack by harmful bacteria. But in a great majority of cases, these enemy bacteria are either quickly destroyed by the beneficent microbes within or are immediately cast out as unfit. Any germs irritating to the intestinal wall cause the mucous membrane to produce an unusual flow of mucus which washes away the offending bacteria in what we call a diarrhea. Begin footnote. If the invading army proves obstinate and the diarrhea continues a day or so, it is wise to assist nature by a dose of castor oil, which gives an additional insult to the intestinal wall, spurs it on to a desperate effort, and hastens the cleansing process. In severe cases, the more promptly the castor oil is administered, the better. Such emergency measures are very different from the habitual use of insulting drugs. End footnote. Sometimes the wrong kind of bacteria do persist, causing anemia, rheumatism, sciatica, or neuritis. When these disorders are not the result of infection from teeth, tonsils, or other sources of poison, but are really caused by intestinal bacteria, I have found that a diet of buttermilk, lactic acid bacteria, with turnip tops or spinach to supply the necessary mineral salts, often succeeds in planting the right bacteria and driving out the disturbing ones. These disorders are invasions from without, like tuberculosis or malaria, and are as likely to attack the person with easy bowel movements as the one with the most chronic constipation. Auto-intoxication. A good deal of the talk about auto-intoxication is just talk. It sounds well and affords an easy explanation for all sorts of ills, but in a large majority of cases, the diagnosis can hardly be substantiated. Uninformed writers of newspaper articles on the care of the body, or purveyors of purgatives or apparatus for internal baths, are fond of dilating on the foulness of the colon as a leading cause of disease. As a rule, they advise either a strict diet, some kind of cathartic, or an elaborate process of washing out the colon to clear the body of its terrible accumulation of poisons. Cathartics and enemas. He who makes a practice of flushing out his intestinal tract with high enemas and internal baths is like a person who eats a good dinner and then proceeds to wash out his stomach. In the mistaken idea that he is making himself clean, he is washing what was never intended to be washed and robbing the body of the nutrition which it needs. And the man who persists in the pill habit is making a worse mistake, adding insult to injury and forcing the mucous membrane to toughen itself against such malicious attacks. Cathartics and operations. Even in emergencies, the use of purgatives as a routine measure is happily decreasing year by year. For many years, I have deplored the use of purgatives before and after operations. That other practitioners are coming to the same conclusion is witnessed by a number of papers recently read in medical societies condemning purgation at the time of operation. Among the most favorably received papers of the California medical societies have been one by Emmett L. Rixford, surgeon of the Stanford University Medical College, read before the Southern California Medical Society at Los Angeles, December 8, 1916, and one by W.D. Alvarez at the California Medical Society, Del Monte, 1918, both condemning the use of purgatives as a routine measure before operations. An article entitled "The Use and Abuse of Cathartics" in the Journal of the American Medical Association admirably summarizes the disadvantages of purgation at such a time. 4 years ago, I was called to a nearby city to see a former patient who 2 days before had had a minor operation, removal of a cyst of the breast. She was dazed, almost in a state of surgical shock and very near collapse. I found that she had been put through the usual course of purgation before operation and starvation afterward, and I diagnosed her condition as a state bordering on acidosis, or lowering of the alkaline salts of the body. I ordered food at once. She rallied and recovered. A few months later, this same woman had to undergo a much more serious operation for multiple fibroids of the uterus and removal of the appendix. This time I advised the surgeon against the use of any purgative, and he took my remarks so seriously that he did not even allow an enema to be given. This time the patient showed no signs of exhaustion and had very few gas pains. I firmly believe that the day will soon come when a patient under operation or a patient after childbirth will no longer be depleted by a weakening and dehydrating cathartic and by a period of starvation at a time when he needs all the energy he can summon. Cathartics and childbirth. The article referred to in the Journal of the American Medical Association cites the experiences of Dr. R. McPherson of the Lying-In Hospital of New York, who showed that the routine purgation after confinement is not only useless but harmful. Of 322 women who were not purged, only 3 had fever, and one of them a mammary abscess. Most of them had normal bowel movements, and those who did not were given an enema every 3rd day. Of 322 women who were delivered by the same technique and the same operators but were purged in the usual routine manner, 28 had some fever. This experience of one physician is corroborated by that of others who find that the more we tamper with the natural functions in time of stress, the harder do we make the recuperative process. There are certainly times when catharsis is necessary, but one thing is certain: the day for routine purgation is past. Even in emergencies, we need to know why we administer cathartics, and in chronic cases, we may be sure that they are always a mistake. An old trick. Before we make a practice of interfering with nature's processes, it is well to remember how old and stable those processes are. As long as there has been the taking in of food, there has been also the casting out of waste matter. The sea anemone closes in on the little mollusk that floats against its waving petals, assimilates what it can, and rejects the rest. In the long line from sea anemone to man, this automatic process of elimination has gone on without a hitch, adapting itself with perfect success to the changing habits of the varying types of life. So old a process is not easily upset. And, be it noted, in the human body, this automatic, involuntary process still goes on with very little trouble until it reaches a point in the body where man, the thinking animal, tries to control it by conscious thought. A question of evacuation. Much of the misconception about constipation arises from the mistaken idea that this is a disorder of the whole intestine, or at least of the whole colon. As a matter of fact, the trouble is almost wholly in the rectum. There is no trouble with the general traffic movement, but only with the unloading at the terminus. In my experience, the patient reports that he feels the fecal mass in the lower part of the rectum, but that he is unable to expel it. Examination by finger or by X-ray reveals a mass in the rectal pouch. If there is a piling up of freight further back on the line, it is only because the unloading process has been delayed at the terminus. So long as the bowel content is in the region of automatic control, there is very little likelihood of trouble. An occasional case of organic trouble, appendicitis, lead colic, mechanical obstruction, new growths or spinal cord disease may cause a real blockade, but in 99 cases out of every 100, There is little trouble so long as the involuntary muscles, working automatically under the direction of the subconscious mind, are in control. By slow or rapid stages, on time or behind time, the bowel content reaches the upper part of the rectum and passes through a little valve into the lower pouch. Here is where the trouble begins. Meddlesome interference. In the natural state, the little human, like the other animals, empties his bowel whenever the fecal mass enters the lower portion of the rectum. The presence of the mass in the rectum constitutes a call to stool, which is responded to as unthinkingly as is the desire for air in the taking of a breath. But the tiny child soon has to learn to control some of his natural functions. At the lower end of the rectum, there is a purse string muscle called the sphincter ani, an involuntary muscle which may, with training, be brought partly under voluntary control. Under the demands of civilization, the baby learns to tighten up this muscle until the proper time for evacuation. Then, if he be normal, he lets go. The muscles higher up contract, and the bowel empties itself automatically, as it always did before civilization began. There is, however, a possibility of trouble whenever the conscious mind tries to assume control of functions which are meant to be automatic. Under certain conditions, necessary control becomes meddlesome interference. If the child, for one reason or another, takes too much interest in the function of elimination, if he likes too much of the sense gratification from stimulation of the rectal nerves and learns to increase this gratification by holding back the fecal mass, if he gets the idea that the function is not nice and takes the interest that one naturally feels in subjects that are taboo, or if he catches from his elders the suggestion that the bowel movement is a highly important process and that something disastrous is likely to happen unless it is successfully performed every day, then his very interest in the matter tends to interfere with automatic regulation and to cause trouble. Just as people often find it hard to let go the bladder muscle and urinate when in a hurry or under observation, and just as an apprehensive woman in childbirth tightens up the purse string muscles of the womb, so the little child, or the grown-up who catches the suggestion of difficulty in the bowel movement, loses the trick of letting go. Instead of merely exercising control by temporarily inhibiting the function, he tries to carry through the process itself by voluntary control, and fails. Constipation is a perfect example of the power of suggestion and of the troublesome effect of a fear idea in the realm of automatic functions. Food and constipation. Since the waste matter from all foods finally reaches the rectum, and since constipation is merely a difficulty in the forces of expulsion, it is hard to see how any normal food in the quantities usually eaten could have the slightest effect on the problem. When we remember that it takes food from 12 to 24 hours to reach the rectum, and that it has during all that time been subjected to the action of the powerful chemicals of the digestive tract, it is hard to imagine a piece of cheese, of whatever variety, strong enough to stop the contraction of the muscles of the upper rectum or to tie the sphincter muscle into a knot. It would be difficult to find a food which could pass without effect through 27 feet of intestinal tubing, only to become suddenly effective on the wall of the rectum. If the wrong kind of food is the cause of constipation, why does the rectum prove to be the most refractory portion of the tube? On what principle could a piece of chocolate inhibit the call to stool or contract the sphincter muscle? On the other hand, even if it should be conceded that constipation were the result of lack of lubricating secretions in the colon, how could 2 tablespoonfuls of mineral oil be a sufficient lubricant after being mixed with liquid and solid food through many feet of the intestinal tract? An adaptable apparatus. The lining of the intestines has plenty of secretions to take care of its function. It is as well adapted to the vicissitudes of life as are the other parts of the body. The muscular coat is no more liable to paralysis or spasm than are the voluntary muscles. As the skin adapts itself to all waters and all weathers, and as the lungs adjust themselves to varying air pressures, so the intestinal wall makes ready adaptation to any common sense demands. adjusting itself with ease to an athletic or a sedentary life, and to the normal variations of diet. What man has eaten throughout the centuries, man may eat today. If you will but believe it, your intestines will make no more objection to white bread, blackberries, and cheese, along with all other ordinary articles of food, than the skin makes to varying kinds of water. Naturally, the suggested idea that a food will constipate tends to carry itself out to fulfillment and to prevent the call to stool from rising to the level of consciousness. But the real force lies not in the food, but in the suggestion. The bran fad. It is when we try to improve on the normal human diet that we really insult the body. He who leaves off eating nourishing white bread and takes to bran muffins is simply cheating his body. Bran has a small food value, but the human body is not made to extract it. Not only does bran fail to give us any nourishment itself, but it lessens the power of the intestines to care for other food. The fad for bran is based on the well-known fact that we need a certain quantity of bulk in order to stimulate the intestinal wall to normal peristalsis. We do need bulk, but not more than we naturally get from a normal and varied diet, including a reasonable amount of fruit and vegetables. It is true that the suggestion of the efficacy of bran, dates, spinach, or any other food is frequently quite sufficient to give relief, temporarily, just as massage, manipulation of the vertebrae, the surgeon's knife, or mineral oil may be enough to carry the conviction of power to a suggestible individual. But who wants to take his suggestions in such inconvenient forms as these? Change of water. Another popular superstition centers around drinking waters. There are people who cannot move from one town to another, much less take an extensive trip, without a fit of constipation or a box of pills. If they only knew it, there is no water on earth which could make a person constipated. A new water, full of unusual minerals, might hasten the bowel movement, but on what possible principle could it retard it? Constipation has nothing to do with food or with water, but solicitous care about either can hardly fail to create the trouble which it tries to avoid. The cure. Taking off the brakes. Since constipation is wholly due to the acceptance of a false suggestion, the only logical cure must be release from the power of that suggestion. He is able as soon as he thinks he is able. Not that thought gives the power, but that the right thought releases the inhibition of the mistaken thought. As soon as the brakes are taken off, the internal machinery is quite able to make the wheels go round. The bowel will empty itself if we let it. The function of elimination is not a new trick learned with difficulty by the aged, but a trick as old and as elemental as life itself. Like balancing on a bicycle, it may not be done by any voluntary muscular effort, but it just does itself when one learns how. Once the sense of power comes, once the mind forgets to be doubtful or afraid, then the old automatic habit invariably reasserts itself. Meddlesome interference may throw the mechanism out of gear, but fortunately it cannot strip the gears. Constipation is an inhibition or restraint of function, but is never a loss of function. No one is too old, no one is too fixed in the bad habit to relearn the old trick. I have had a good many patients with chronic constipation, but I have never had one who failed to learn. Real conviction speedily brings success, and in many cases, success seems to outrun conviction. So efficient is nature if she has only half a chance. Some people who learned. Unless you are over 92, do not despair. One old lady of that age, a sort of patient by proxy, was able to cure herself without even one consultation. Her daughter had been a patient of mine and had been cured of the constipation with which she had been busy for many years. The mother, who believed her own bowel paralyzed, had been in the habit of lying on the bed and taking a copious enema every second day of her life. When, however, she heard of her daughter's cure, the bright old woman gave up her enemas and let her bowels do their own functioning. She stayed cured until her death at 95. A 50-year habit. Another old lady was not quite so easily convinced. She ridiculed the idea that her son of 50, who had been constipated in his cradle, could be cured of his lifelong habit. But he was cured. As long as there is life and the light of reason, so long may nature's functions be re-established. The whole family. Nor is anyone too young to learn. A tiny baby is easily taught. There came to me for 2 consultations a mother and her 2 babies, all 3 constipated. The 4-year-old child, mentally deficient, had been fed on milk of magnesia from his infancy, and the 4-month-old baby had been started on the same path. I explained to the mother the mechanism of elimination, told her to give up cathartics and to set a regular time for herself and the baby, but was a little dubious about the mentally deficient 4-year-old. However, she soon reported that they had all 3 promptly acquired the new habit. 4 years later, she told me that they had never had any more trouble. A record history. When Miss H first came to my house, she told a story that was almost incredible. She said that for many months she had been taking 8 tablespoonfuls of mineral oil 3 times a day, besides a cathartic at night, and an enema in the morning. No wonder she was a little dubious over such mild treatment as mine seemed to be. Constipation was only one of this young woman's troubles. She could not sleep and was so fatigued that she believed herself at the end of her physical capital. When she first came to me, she had tears in her eyes most of the time and used to confide to various people that she was sure she was a patient that I could not cure, a very common belief among nervous invalids. She was sure that I did not understand her case and that she could not get anything out of this kind of treatment. It was only a very short time, however, before her bowels were functioning like those of a normal person. She lost her insomnia and her fatigue and went away as well as ever. When she got back to her office, she found that her old position, which she had believed secure to her, had been given to another. She had to go out and hunt a new job and face conditions harder than she had had before, but she came through with flying colours. A short time ago, Miss H came back to see me, a happy, robust young woman, very different from the person I had first known. She assured me that she had never had any return of her old symptoms and that she was as well as a person could be. Living up to a suggestion. Mrs. T had not had a natural movement of the bowel in 25 years. After the birth of a child, 25 years before, her physician had told her that her muscles had been so badly torn in labor that they could not carry through a natural movement. After that, she had never gone a day without a pill or an enema. I explained to her that when any muscle of the rectum is injured in childbirth, it is the sphincter ani, and that since this is the muscle whose contraction holds back the bowel content, its injury would tend to over-free evacuation rather than to constipation. She saw the point, and within 2 or 3 days regained her old power of spontaneous evacuation. Practical steps. The first step, then, in acquiring normal habits is the conviction of the integrity of our physical machines and a determination not to interfere by thought or by physical meddling with the elemental functions of our bodies. After this all-important step, there are a few practical suggestions which it is well to follow. Most of them are nothing more than the common-sense habits of personal hygiene, which are so obvious as to be almost axiomatic, but which are nevertheless often neglected. 1. Eat 3 square meals a day. 2. Drink when thirsty, having conveniently at hand the facilities for drinking. 3. Heed the call to stool as you heed the call of hunger. When the stool passes the little valve between the upper and lower portions of the rectum, it gives the signal that the time for evacuation has come. If this signal is always heeded, it will automatically start the machinery that leads to evacuation. If it is persistently ignored because one is too busy or because the mind is filled with the idea of disability, the call very soon fails to rise to the level of consciousness. The feces remain in the rectum and the bad habit is begun. 4. Choose a regular time and keep that appointment with yourself as regularly as possible. In all the activities of nature, there is a rhythm which it is well to observe. 5. Take time to acquire the habit. Do not be in a hurry. Do not strain. No amount of effort will start the movement. Just let it come of itself. 6. Finally, should the unconscious suggestion of lack of power stubbornly remain in force, take a small enema on the 3rd day. If the waste matter accumulates for 3 or more days, the bulk becomes so great that the circular muscles of the rectum are unable to handle it, just as the fingers cannot squeeze down to expel water from too large a mass of wet blankets. Take only a small enema, never over a quart at a time, and expel the water immediately. 1 or 2 such measures will bring away the mass in the rectum. The material farther up still contains food elements and is not yet ready for expulsion. Lessen the amount of water each time until no outside help is needed. Once you get the right idea, all enemas will be superfluous. Summary. If you would have in a nutshell an epitome of the truth about constipation, indigestion, insomnia, and the other functional disturbances common to nervous folk, you can do no better than to commit to memory and store away for future reference that choice limerick of the centipede, which so admirably sums up the whole matter of meddlesome interference. A centipede was happy quite until a frog in fun said, "Pray, which leg comes after which?" This raised her mind to such a pitch, she lay distracted in the ditch, considering how to run. Whoever tries to consider which leg comes after which in any line of physiological activity is pretty sure to find himself in the ditch considering how to run. Wherefore, remember the centipede. End of chapter 11.
Section 12 of Outwitting Our Nerves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury. Chapter 12, in which handicaps are dropped. A woman's ills. The female of the species. If ever there was a man who wished himself a woman, he has hidden away the desire within the recesses of his own heart. But one does not have to wait long to hear a member of the female sex exclaim with evident emotion, "Oh dear, I wish I had been born a man." It is probable that if these same women were given the chance to transform themselves overnight, they would hesitate long when it actually came to the point. The joys of being a woman are real joys. However, in too many cases, these joys seem hardly to compensate for the discomforts of the feminine organism. It is the body that drags, painful menstrual periods, the dreaded change of life, various female troubles with a number of pregnancies scattered along between, make some of the daughters of Eve feel that they spend a good deal of their lives paying a penalty merely for being women. Brought up to believe themselves heirs to a curse laid on the first woman, they accept their discomforts with resignation and try to make the best of a bad business. Since the war. Nothing is quite the same since the war. Among other things, we have learned that many of our so-called handicaps were nothing but illusions, base libels on the female body. Under the stern necessity of war, the women of the world discovered that they could stand up under jobs which have until now been considered quite beyond their powers. Society girls who were used to coddling themselves found a new joy in hard and continuous work. Middle-aged women who were supposed to be at the time of life when little could be expected of them quite forgot themselves in service. Ambulance drivers, nurses, welfare workers, farmerettes, Red Cross workers, streetcar conductors, and bellboys revealed to themselves and to the world unsuspected powers of endurance in a woman's body. Although some of the heavier occupations still seem to be man's work, better fitted for a man's sturdier body, we know now that many of these disabilities were merely a matter of tradition and faulty training. There still remains, however, a goodly number of women who are continuously or periodically below par because of some form of feminine disability. Some of these women are suffering from real physical handicaps, but many of them need to be told that they are disabled not by reason of being women, but by reason of being nervous women. Nerves again. Despite the organic disturbances which may beset the reproductive organs, and despite the havoc wrought by venereal diseases, it may be said with absolute assurance that the majority of feminine ills are the result neither of the natural frailty of the female body, nor even of man's infringement of the social law, but are the direct result of false suggestion and of false attitudes toward the facts of the reproductive life. The trouble is less a difficulty with the reproductive organs than a difficulty with the reproductive instinct. Something wrong with the instinct is translated by the subconscious mind into something wrong with the related generative organs and converted into a physical pain. That this relation has always been dimly felt is shown by the fact that the early Greeks called nervous disorders hysteria, from the Greek word for womb. It is only lately, however, that the blame has been put in the right place and the trouble traced to the instinct rather than to the organs of reproduction. Why women are nervous. Although women hold no monopoly, it must be conceded that they are particularly prone to nerves. The reason is not hard to find. Since the leading factor in a neurosis is a disturbance of the insistent instinct of reproduction, a disturbance usually based on repression, then any class of persons in whom the instinct is particularly repressed would, in the very nature of the case, be particularly liable to nervousness. No one who thoroughly knows human nature would attempt to deny that woman is as strongly endowed as man with the great urge toward the perpetuation of the race, or that she has had to repress the instinct more severely than has man. The man insists on knowing that the children he provides for are his own. Whatever the degree of his own fidelity, he must be sure that his wife is true to him. Thus has grown up the insistence that, no matter what man does, woman, if she is to be counted respectable, shall control the urge of the instinct and live up to the requirement of continence set for her by society. Unfortunately, however, there is more often blind repression than rational control. The measures taken to prevent a girl's becoming a tomboy are measures of sex repression quite as much as of sex differentiation. Overreaction of sensitive little souls to lessons in modesty often causes distortion of normal sex development. Ignorance concerning the phenomena of life is commended as innocence, while it really implies a sex curiosity which has been too severely repressed. The young woman blushes at thoughts of love, while the young man is filled with a sense of dignity. We smile at the picture of Miss Philura's confusion as she hesitatingly sends up to her creator a petition for the much-desired boon of a husband. But really, why shouldn't she want one? Many a young woman, in order to deaden her senses to the unsuspected lure of the reproductive instinct, by what is really an awkward attempt at sublimation, makes a fetish of dress and social position and considers only the marriage of convenience, or, on the other hand, she scorns men altogether and throws herself into a career. Young men are not so often taught to repress, but neither are they taught to swing their vital energies to altruistic channels through sublimation. Since the woman of his class will not marry him until he has money, the young man too often satisfies his undirected instincts in a commercial way. The statistics of venereal diseases prove that here, as elsewhere, goods subject to barter are subject to contamination. In a late marriage, too often, a contaminated body accompanies the material possessions which the standards of society have demanded of a husband. But the woman pays in still other coin for the repressions arising from faulty childhood training, unable to find expression for herself either in marriage or in devotion to work, because of some old childish repression, is still denying all outlet to her legitimate desire. She frequently falls into a neurosis, or if she escapes a real breakdown, she gives expression to unsatisfied longings in some isolated nervous symptoms, which in many cases center about the organs of generation. There then results any one of the various functional disturbances which are only too often mistaken for organic disease. What is needed in cases like this is not a gynecologist nor a surgeon, but a psychopathologist, or perhaps only a grasp of the facts. Let us look at the more common of these disturbances in order to gain an understanding of the situation. The menstrual period. Potential motherhood. Among the normal phenomena of a woman's life is the recurring cycle of potential motherhood. Every 3 or 4 weeks, a new ovum or egg matures in the ovary and undergoes certain chemical changes, which send into the blood a substance called a hormone. This hormone is a messenger, stimulating the mucous membrane of the womb into making its velvet pile longer and softer, and its nutrient juices more abundant in readiness for the ovum. The same stimulus causes the whole organism to make ready for a new life. As in hunger, the chemistry of the body produces the muscle tension that is felt as a craving for food. So this recurring chemical stimulus produces a definite craving in the body and mind. This craving brings about an increased irritability or sensitiveness to stimuli, which may result either in a joyous or a fretful mood. During sleep, the social inhibitions are felt less distinctly, and the sleeper dreams love dreams woven from messages coming up from all the minute nerve endings in the expectant reproductive organs. But if no germ cell travels up the womb canal and tube to meet and impregnate the ovum, the womb lining rejects the egg as chemically unfit. The phenomenon as a whole is a physiological function and should be accompanied by a sense of well-being and comfort, as is the exercise of any other function, such as digestion or muscular activity. Only too often, however, it is dreaded as an unmitigated disaster, a time for giving up work or fun and going to bed with a hot water bottle until the worst is over. Let us see how this perversion comes about. Why menstruation is painful. What sort of atmosphere is created for the young girl as she attains puberty? Most girls get their first inkling of the menstrual period from the periodic sick spells of the mother or sister. This knowledge comes without conscious thought and is a direct observation of the subconscious mind, which records impressions with the accuracy and completeness of a photographic plate. Hearing the talk about a sick time and observing the signs of cramps among older friends, the girl's subconscious mind plays up to the suggestion and recoils with fear from the newly experienced sensations in the maturing organs of reproduction. This recoil of fear interferes with the circulation in the functioning organs, just as fear blanches the face or hinders digestion. There is several times as much blood in the stomach when it is full of food as there is between meals, but we do not for this reason fancy that we have a pain after each meal. There is more blood in the generative organs during their functioning, but this means pain only when fear ties up the circulation and causes undue congestion. Fear acts further on the sturdy muscle of the womb, tying it up into just such knots as we feel in the esophagus when we say that we have a lump in the throat. It is safe to say that 95 cases of painful menstruation out of every 100 are caused by fear and by expectation of pain. The cysts and tumors responsible for pain are so rare as to be fairly negligible when compared with these other causes. Dr. Clelia Duell Mosher of Stanford University has for many years carried on careful investigations among the students of the university. After describing in detail certain physical exercises which she has found of value, she continues, quote, "But more important even than this is the alteration of the morbid attitude of women themselves toward this function, And almost equally essential is a fundamental change in the habit of mind on our part as physicians. For do we not tend to translate too much the whole of a woman's life into terms of menstruation? If every young girl were taught that menstruation is not normally a bad time and that pain or incapacity at that period is as discreditable and unnecessary as bad breath due to decaying teeth, we might almost look for a revolution in the physical life of women. In my experience, the traditional treatment of rest in bed, directing the attention solely to the sex zone of the body, and the accepted theory that it is an inevitable illness, while at the same time the mind is without occupation, produces a morbid attitude and favors the development and exaggeration of whatever symptoms there may be. End quote. Clelia Duell Mosher, Health and the Woman Movement, pages 25, 26, 19. Premenstrual discomfort. If it be objected that women often feel badly for a day or two before the period begins, before they know that it is due, and that this feeling of discomfort could not be caused by fear and expectation, it is easy to reply that the subconscious mind knows perfectly what is happening within the body. The emotion of fear working within the subconscious is able to translate all the varying bodily sensations into feelings of distress without any knowledge on the part of the conscious mind. Sometimes before the period begins, a girl feels blue and upset for a day or two, a sign that the instinct is getting discouraged. The whole body is saying, get ready, but it has gotten ready many times before and to no purpose. Unsatisfied striving brings discouragement. What reaches consciousness is a feeling of pessimism and a general dissatisfaction with life as a whole. If, instead of giving in to the blues or going to bed and predicting a pain, the girl finds other outlets for her energy, she finds that after all, her instinct may be satisfied in indirect ways, and that she has strangely come into a new supply of vim. The purpose of the pain. Although suggestion is behind all nervous symptoms, there is a deeper reason for the disturbance. When an unhealthy suggestion is seized and acted upon, it is because some unsatisfied part of the personality sees in it a chance for accomplishing its own ends. The premenstrual period is the blooming time, the mating time, the springtime of the organism. That means imminently a time for coming into notice that one's charms may attract the desired complement. But if the rightfully insistent instinctive desires are held in check by unnatural repressions and misapplied social restrictions, the starved instinct can obtain expression only by a concealment of purpose. The disguise assumed is often one of indifference or positive distaste for the allurements of the other sex, but, as we know, an instinctive desire will not be denied. In this case, the misguided instinct, which has been given the suggestion that menstruation means illness, fits this conception into the scheme of things and obtains notice in a roundabout way by the attention given to the invalid. The treatment. To find that the symptom has a purpose rather than a cause gives the indication for the treatment. Judicious neglect causes the symptom to cease by defeating its very purpose, that of drawing attention to itself. The person who never mentions her discomfort thinks about it as little as possible and goes about her business as usual is likely to find her trouble gone before she realizes it. Quote, violent exercise at this time is unwise, but continuing one's usual activity helps the circulation and keeps the mind from centering on the affected part. The physiological congestion is unduly intensified by standing. Therefore, all employments should afford facilities for the woman to sit at least part of the time while continuing to work. End quote. A little explanation gives the patient insight into the workings of her own mind, and usually causes the pain to disappear in short order. Astonished indeed, and filled with gratitude, have been some of my young women patients, who had all their lives been unable to plan any work or social engagements for the time of this functioning. Many of them were the worst kind of doubters when they were told that to go to bed and center their attention on the generative organs only made the muscles tighten up and the circulation congest. They could not conceive themselves up and around, pursuing their normal life during such a time. However, as they have found by experience that this point of view is not an optimistic dream, they have broken up the confidence game which their subconscious had been playing on them and have gone on their way rejoicing. There was one girl, a doctor's daughter, who suffered continuously from pain in the abdomen and from back pain which increased so greatly at the time of the menses that she was in the habit of going to bed for several days to be waited on with solicitous care by her family. In an attempt to cure the trouble, she had undergone an operation to suspend the uterus, but the pain had continued as before. When she came to me, I explained to her that there was no physical difficulty and that her trouble was wholly nervous. I made her play tennis every day, and she had just finished a game when her period came on. She stayed up for luncheon, went for a walk in the afternoon, ate her dinner with the family, and behaved like other people. Her mother telephoned that evening, and when I told her what her daughter had been doing, she gasped in astonishment. She had difficulty in believing that the new order was not miracle, but simply the working out of natural law. Since that time, her daughter has had no more trouble. The ounce of prevention. If young girls had wiser counselors in their mothers and physicians, the misconception would never occur, and such indirect outlet would not be needed. The organic sensations incident to puberty and the recurring menstrual period would have something of the significance of the Annunciation to Mary, bringing wonder and a sense of well-being. When your little daughter arrives at maturity, give her a joyous initiation into the noble order of women. She will welcome the new function as a badge of womanhood and as a harbinger of wonderful things to come. A girl of 15 came under my care to be helped out of a mood of increasing depression and uneasiness. Her glance was furtive, yet anxiously expectant. Tears came unbidden as she sat alone or fingered the keys of the piano. Tactful questioning elicited no response as to reasons for her unhappiness. Opportunities for giving confidence were not accepted. At a chance moment, our talk drifted to the subject of menstruation. Your periods are regular and easy, and do you know what they are for? Then I painted for her a picture of the preparations that are made throughout the whole organism for the germ cell that comes each month and has in it all the possibilities of a new little life. The result of this confidential talk may seem fanciful to anyone but an eyewitness. We had only a week's association, but the depression ceased. The furtive look and deprecatory manner were replaced by a joyous buoyancy. In a few weeks, the thin neck and awkward body rounded out into the symmetry which usually precedes the establishment of puberty, but which was delayed in this case until the unconscious conflict resolved itself. In the large. Looked at from any angle, this subject is an important one. There are involved not only the physical comfort and convenience of the sufferers themselves, but also the economic prospects of women as a whole. If women are to demand equal opportunity and equal pay, they must be able to do equal work without periodic times of illness. When employers of women tell us that they regularly have to hire extra help because some of their workers lose time each month, we realize how great is the aggregate of economic waste, a waste which would assuredly be justified if the health of the country's womanhood were really involved, but which is inefficient and unnecessary when caused merely by ignorant tradition. Up to standard every day of every week is a slogan quite within the range of possibility for all but the seriously ill. When reduced to their lowest terms, the inconveniences of this function are not great and are not too dear a price to pay for the possibilities of motherhood. The change of life. Another phantom peril. As the young girl is taught to fear the menstrual period, so the older woman is taught to dread the time when the periods shall cease. Despite the general enlightenment of this day and age, the menopause or change of life is all too frequently feared as a critical period in a woman's life, a time of distressing physical sensations and even of danger to mental balance. As a matter of fact, the menopause is a physiological process which should be accomplished with as little mental and physical disturbance as accompanies the establishment of puberty. The same internal secretion is concerned in both. When the function of ovulation ceases, the body has to find a new way to dispose of the internal secretion of the ovary. Its presence in the blood is the cause of the sudden dilation of the blood vessels that is known as the hot flash. The matter is altogether a problem of chemistry, with the necessity for a new adjustment among the glands of internal secretion. The body easily manages this if left to itself, but is greatly interfered with by the wrong suggestion and emotion. We have already seen how quickly emotion affects all secretions and how easily the adrenal and thyroid glands are influenced by fear. This is the root of the trouble in many cases of difficult change. If an occasional body is not quite able to regulate the chemical readjustment, we may have to administer the glands of some other animal, but in the majority of cases, the body, unhampered by an extra burden of fear, is quite able to make its own adjustments. The hot flash passes in a moment, if not prolonged by emotion, or if not converted into a habit by attention. One source of trouble in the menopause is that it comes at a time in a woman's life when she is likely to have too much leisure. In no way can a woman so easily handicap her body at this time as by stopping work and being afraid. Those women who have had to go on as usual find themselves past the change almost before they knew it, unless they consider themselves abused and worry over the necessity for working through such a critical time. 3 rules. Here are a few pointers which have been of help to a number of women. 1. Remember that this is a physiological process and therefore abundantly safeguarded by nature. If you don't expect trouble, you will not be likely to find it. 2. Remember that the sweating and flushing are made worse by notice. 3. Do everything in your power to keep from the public the knowledge that you are no longer a potential mother. If you are past 40, do not mop your face or gasp for breath or carry a fan to the theater. Shun attention and fear, and you will be surprised at the ease with which the change is effected. Nature's last chance. While we are on the subject of the middle-aged woman, it may be well to mention a phenomenon sometimes noticed in the early 40s. Often an old maid who has considered herself settled for life in her bachelor estate suddenly takes to herself a husband. I use the verb advisedly. Mothers who have thought their childbearing days long past sometimes find themselves pregnant. The child of her old age is not an uncommon occurrence. Unmarried women who have kept straight all their lives sometimes go down before temptation at this late time. There is a reason. It is as though nature were making a last desperate attempt to produce another life before it is too late, speeding up all the internal secretions and flashing insistent messages throughout the whole organism. It may help some woman who feels herself inexplicably impelled toward the male sex to know that she is not being tempted by the devil, but merely driven by the insistent chemicals within her body. She is likely to rationalize and tell herself that it is too bad for a worthwhile person like herself to leave no progeny behind her. Or she may say, as one of my patients did when contemplating running away with another woman's husband, that she could make that man so much happier than his wife did, and that she really owed it to him as well as to herself. When a woman knows what is the matter with her, it makes it easier to bide her time and wait for the demands of nature to subside. Chemicals may not be so romantic as love, but neither are they so melodramatic. Other troubles. Speaking of operations, physicians are often called upon to diagnose some such vague symptoms as pain in the abdomen, back and head, ache in the legs, constipation, or loss of appetite. Since the patient is very insistent that something shall be done, the physician may be driven to operate, even when he has an uneasy feeling that the trouble is merely nervous. 60% of the operations on women are necessitated by the result of gonorrheal infection. Next in frequency up to recent date have been operations for nervous symptoms which could in no way be reached by the knife. Only too often a nerve specialist hears the tale of an operation which was supposed to cure a certain pain, but which left it worse rather than better. It is a pleasure to see some of these pains disappear under a little re-education, but one cannot help wishing that the re-education had come before the knife instead of after it. A skilled surgeon can cut almost anything out of a person's body, but he cannot cut out an instinct. It sometimes takes great skill to determine whether the trouble is an organic affection or a functional disturbance caused by the misdirected instinct of reproduction. Often, however, the clinical pictures are so different as to leave no room for doubt, provided the diagnostician has his eyes open and is not overly persuaded by the importunity of the poor neurotic, who insists that the surgeon shall remove her appendix, her gallbladder, her genital organs, and her tonsils, and who finally comes back that he may have a whack at the operation scar. The bearing of children. A number of years ago, I became acquainted with a charming young married woman who had all her life recoiled with fear from the phenomena of sex. She had been afraid of menstruation and of marriage, and had at this time almost a phobia for pregnancy and childbirth. Before long, she came to me in terror, telling me that she had become pregnant. I explained to her that pregnancy is the time when most women are at their best, that the nausea which is often troublesome in the beginning is caused merely by a mixing of messages from the autonomic nerves, which refer new sensations in the womb to the more usual center of activity in the stomach, and that after the body has become accustomed to these sensations, most women experience a greater sense of well-being and peace than at any other time in life. We had a conversation or two on the subject, and everything seemed to go well for a while. As it happened, this young woman and her husband came to call on me one afternoon just before the baby was expected. During the visit, she began to show signs of being in labor. Again, she was in terror. Again, I explained the phenomena of labor, telling her that the womb contractions are caused by the presence in the blood of a chemical secretion hormone which continues its good work as long as there is a state of confidence, but which sometimes stops under fear or apprehension. I explained that these womb efforts are a peristaltic movement, a contraction of the upper muscles and a letting go of the purse string muscle at the mouth of the womb, and that fear only tends to tie up this purse string muscle, making a difficult process out of one which is intended by nature to be much more simple. She seemed to understand and to lose a good deal of her fright. About 6 o'clock the couple went home on the streetcar from the upper end of Pasadena to the far end of Los Angeles. The next morning I had a jubilant telephone message from the happy father, announcing that the boy baby had arrived at midnight, and that, wonderful to relate, he had come without the mother's experiencing any pain whatever. I give this account for what it is worth, without of course contending that labor could always be as easy as this. It happened that this girl was a normal, healthy woman, and that there were no complications of any kind in the process of childbirth. A right attitude of mind could not have corrected any physical difficulty, but it did seem to help her to let go of her fear, which would of itself have caused long and painful labor. A patient once told me that when her first baby came, she happened to be out in the country where she had to call in a doctor whom she did not know. It was an uncouth sort of fellow who inspired fear rather than confidence. She soon found that labor stopped whenever he came into the room and started again when he went out. She had the good sense to send him out and complete her labor with only the help of her mother. Unfortunate is the obstetrician who does not know how to inspire a feeling of confidence in his patients. Even childbirth may be mightily helped or hindered by the mother's state of mind. Summary. A woman's body has more stability than she knows. It is sometimes out of order, but it is more often misunderstood. Usually it is an unobtrusive and satisfactory instrument, quite fit for its daily tasks. The average woman is really well put together. We hear about the ones who have difficulty, but not about the great majority who do not. We notice the few who are upset during the menopause and forget all the others. To be comfortable and efficient most of the time is, after all, merely to be like folks. The special functions which nature has been perfecting in a woman's body are, as a rule, easily carried through unless complicated by false ideas or by fear. If the woman who has no organic difficulty but who still finds herself handicapped by her body will cease being either resigned to her languishing lot or envious of her stalwart brothers, if instead she will set out to learn how to be efficient as a woman, she will find that many of her ills are not the blunders of an inefficient creator, but are homemade products which quickly vanish in the light of understanding. End of chapter 12.
Section number 13 of Outwitting Our Nerves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jrose. Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury. Chapter 13, in which we lose our dread of night. That interesting insomnia. The fear of staying awake. To sleep or not to sleep, that is the question. In all the world there is nothing to equal it in importance to the man with insomnia. His days are mere interludes between troubled nights spent in restless tossing to and fro and feverish worry over the weary day to come. His mind filled with ideas about the disastrous effects of insomnia, he imagines himself fast sliding downhill toward the grave or the insane asylum. It is true that his conversation very often politely begins something like this. "Good morning. Did you sleep well last night?" But if we fail to respond by an equally polite, "And I hope you had a good night?" he seems restless until he has somehow disillusioned us by stating the exact number of hours and minutes during which he was able to lose himself in slumber. We must not ridicule the man who doesn't sleep. We are all very much alike. If any one of us happens to lie awake for a night or two, he is likely to get into a panic. And if the spell should last a week, he begins looking up steamship agents and talking of voyages to southern seas. The fact is that most people are dreadfully afraid of insomnia. Knowing the effects of a few nights of enforced wakefulness, and having had a little experience with the fagged feeling after a restless night, they believe themselves only logical when they fall into a panic over the prospect of persistent insomnia. Two kinds of wakefulness. As a matter of fact, insomnia is a phantom peril. There is not the slightest danger from lying awake nights, provided one is not kept awake by some irritating physical stimulus. All fear of insomnia is based on ignorance of the difference between enforced wakefulness and deliberate wakefulness, or insomnia. The man who has acquired the habit may stay awake almost indefinitely without appreciable harm, but the one who is kept awake for a week by a pain, by a chemical poison from infection, or by the necessity for staying up on his job may easily be in a state of exhaustion. Even in cases of prolonged pain or overexertion, the body tends to maintain its equilibrium by hastening its rate of repair and by falling asleep before the danger point is reached. It is almost impossible to impair permanently the tissue of the brain except in the presence of a chemical irritant. In case of infection, we often have to give medicine to neutralize the effect of the poison, or to resort to narcotics which make the brain cells less susceptible to irritation. But nervous insomnia is another story. A harmless habit. Long-lived insomniacs. A man of my acquaintance once said in all seriousness and with evident alarm, "I am following in the footsteps of my mother. She lived to be 70 years old, and she had insomnia all her life." If this man had been preaching a sermon on the harmlessness of chronic insomnia, he could not have chosen a better text, but he seemed just as much concerned about himself as if his mother had died from the effects of 3 months' wakefulness. People can live healthy lives during 20 or 30 years of insomnia because chronic insomnia is nothing more or less than a habit, and habit spells ease. The brain cells are not irritated by either internal or external stimuli. There is no effort to keep awake. Virtually no energy is expended, except in restless tossing and worry. If the body is kept still and emotion eliminated, fatigue products are washed away and the reserves are filled in with perfect ease. Thinking in circles. Habit means automatic, subconscious activity with the least expenditure of energy and the least amount of fatigue. We have already noted the ease with which heart and diaphragm muscles carry on their work from the beginning of life to its end. And anything relegated to the subconscious mind can be kept up almost indefinitely without tire. And to this subconscious type of activity belong the thoughts of a chronic insomniac. Despite all assertions to the contrary, his conscious mind is not really awake. If he is questioned about the happenings of the night, he is likely to have been unaware of the most audible noises. The thoughts that run through his brain are not new, constructive, energy-consuming thoughts, but the same old thoughts that have been going around in circles for days and weeks at a time. It is true that a person sometimes chooses to wake up and do his constructive planning in the night. This kind of thought does bring fatigue, up to a certain point. After that, the body hastens its rate of repair or automatically goes to sleep. Activity of this kind is always a matter of choice. He who really prefers sleep will shut the drawers containing the day's business and leave them shut until morning. Daydreaming at night. However, the man who makes a practice of staying awake rarely does much real thinking. He lets the thoughts run through his mind as they will, builds air castles of things he would like to do and can't, or other kinds of air castles about the disastrous effects of his insomnia on the day that is to come. He worries over his health or his finances and grieves over his sorrows. He is really indulging himself, thinking the thoughts he likes most to think, and these consume but little energy. They can go jogging on indefinitely without guidance from the driver. What causes the fatigue? Tossing and fretting. The thing that tires is not the insomnia, but the emotion over the insomnia. If people who fail to sleep are perpetually fagged out, it is not from loss of sleep, but from worry and tossing. Often they spend a good deal of the night feeling sorry for themselves. They turn and toss, exclaiming with each turn, "Why don't I sleep? How badly I shall feel tomorrow! What a night! What a night!" Such a spree of emotionalism can hardly fail to tire, but it is not fair to blame the insomnia. He who makes up his mind to it can rest almost as well without sleep as with it, provided he keeps his mind calm and his body relaxed. Decent hygienic conditions demand not necessarily 8 hours of sleep, but 8 hours of quiet rest in bed. Tossing about drives away sleep and uses up energy. I make it a rule that my patients shall not turn over more than 4 times during the night. This is more important than that they should sleep. To be sure, I do not stay awake to enforce the rule, but most people catch the idea very quickly, and before they know it, they are sleeping. How to go to sleep. Ceasing to care. The best way to learn to sleep is not to care whether you do or not. Nothing could be better than Dubois' advice. Don't look for sleep. It flies away like a pigeon when one pursues it. Attention to anything keeps the mind awake, and most of all, attention to sleep. More than one person has waked up to see whether or not he was going to sleep. We cannot, however, fool ourselves by merely pretending indifference. The only sensible way is to get the facts firmly fixed in our minds so that we actually realize that we do not need more sleep than our bodies take. As soon as it is realized that insomnia is really of no importance, it tends to disappear. Catching the idea. There came one day for consultation a very healthy-looking woman, a deaconess of the Lutheran Church. "Doctor," she said, "I came to get relief from insomnia. For 20 years I have not slept more than 1 or 2 hours a night." "Why do you want more?" I asked. "Why, isn't it very unhealthy not to sleep?" she exclaimed in astonishment. "Evidently not," I answered. This woman had tried every doctor she could think of, including the splendid S. Weir Mitchell. Her insomnia had become a preoccupation with her chief thought in life. All I did was to explain to her that her body had been getting all the sleep it needed, and that neither body nor mind was in the least run down after 20 years of sleeplessness. When you cease being interested in your insomnia, it will go away, although from a health standpoint, it matters very little whether it does or not. We had 2 conversations on the subject, and a week later she came back to tell me that she was sleeping 8 hours a night. One woman had had insomnia for 30 years. After I had explained to her that her body had adjusted itself to this way of living and that she need not try to get more sleep, she snored so loud all night and every night that the rest of her family began to complain. A certain banker proved very quick at catching the idea. He had been so troubled with insomnia and intense weakness that his doctors prescribed a 6 months voyage in southern waters. Knowing that my prescriptions involved a change in point of view rather than in scene, he came to me. Although he had been getting only about half an hour's sleep a night, he went to sleep in his chair the first evening and then went upstairs and slept all night. He resumed his duties at the bank, walking 1.5 miles the first day and 3 miles the second. During the months following, he reported, no more insomnia. Keeping account. A bright young college graduate came to me for a number of ailments, chief among them being sleeplessness. She was also overcome by fatigue, having spent 4 months in bed. A 4-mile walk in the canyon and a few other such outings soon dispelled the fatigue, but the insomnia proved more obstinate. After she had been with me for a week or 2, I took her aside one day for a little talk. "Well," I said as we sat down. Then she began. "Sunday night I was awake from 1:30 to 4, Monday from 12 to 1, Tuesday from 1 to 3, Wednesday from 2 to 4, Thursday..." By this time, she became aware of the quizzical expression on my face and began to be embarrassed. Then she stopped and laughed. "Well," she said, "I did not know that I was paying so much attention to my sleep." She was bright enough to see the point at once, gave up her preoccupation in the all-absorbing topic, and promptly forgot to have any trouble with so natural a function as sleep. Making new associations. Examples like this show how natural is childlike slumber when once we take away the inhibitions of a hampering idea. Age-old habits like sleep are not lost, but they may easily be interfered with by a little too much attention. When a person who can scarcely keep his eyes open all the evening is instantly wide awake as soon as his head touches the pillow, we may be sure that a part of his trouble comes from the wrong associations which he has built up with the thought of night. When a dear little old lady told me of her constant state of apprehension about going to bed, I said to her, "When I go to my room, the darkness says sleep. When I take off my clothes, the very act says sleep. When I put my head on the pillow says sleep." She liked that and found herself able to sleep all night. The next evening she wanted another sleeping potion, but as I did not want her to become dependent on anybody's suggestion, I put my mouth up close to her ear and whispered, "Abracadabra, dum dum dum." She laughed, but saw the point. After that, she slept very well. She merely broke the habit by making a new kind of association with the thought of bed. Nature did the rest. It seems hardly necessary to remark that drug taking is the most inefficient way of handling the situation. Everybody knows that narcotics are harmful to the delicate cells of the brain and that the dose has to be continuously increased in cases of chronic insomnia. If a person realizes that the drug is far more harmful than the insomnia itself, he is weak indeed to yield to temptation for the sake of a few nights of sleep. As the cause of insomnia is psychic, so the only logical cure is a new idea and a new attitude of mind. The purpose of insomnia. Like all nervous symptoms, insomnia is not an infliction, but an indulgence. Somehow, and in ways unknown to the conscious mind, it brings a certain amount of satisfaction to a part of the personality. No matter how unpleasant it may be, no matter how much we consciously fear it, something inside chooses to stay awake. Started, as a rule, through suggestion or imitation, insomnia is sometimes kept up as a means of making ourselves seem important, to ourselves and to others. It at least provides an excuse for thinking and talking about ourselves, and furnishes a certain feeling of distinction. If something within us craves attention, even staying awake may not be too dear a price to pay for that attention. Strange to say, there are other times when the insomnia is chosen by the primitive subconscious mind with the idea of doing penance for supposed sins whose evil effects might possibly be avoided by this kind of expiation. Analysis shows that motives like this are not so uncommon as might be supposed. In other cases, insomnia is chosen for the chance it gives for fantasy building. A person denied the right kind of outlet for his instincts may so enjoy the daydreaming habit that he prolongs it into the night, really preferring it to sleep. Such a state of affairs is not at all incompatible with an intense conscious desire to sleep and a real fear of insomnia. So strange may be the motives hidden away within the depths of the most prosaic individual. Summary. Nervous insomnia is something which a part of us makes use of and another part fears. It is a mistake on both sides. Although not in the least dangerous, the habit can hardly be considered a satisfactory form of amusement. Nature has provided a better way to spend the night, a way to which she speedily brings us when we choose to let her do it. We do not have to ask for sleep as for a special boon which may be denied. We simply have to lie down and trust, expecting to be carried away like a child. If our expectation is not at once realized, we can still trust, as with relaxed mind and body we lie in calm content, knowing that nature is, minute by minute, restoring us for another day. End of section number 13. Read by Jrose, Los Angeles, March 8th, 2025.
Section 14 of Outwitting Our Nerves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tim Rowe. Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury, in which we raise our thresholds, feeling our feelings, finely strung violins. The young girl had been telling me about her symptoms. "You know, Doctor," she said, "I'm a very sensitive person. In fact, I've always been told that I'm like a finely strung violin." There was a pride in every tone of her voice, pride and satisfaction over possessing an organization so superior to the common clay of the average person. It was a typical remark and showed clearly that this girl belonged among the nervous folk. For the nervous person is not only oversensitive, but he accepts his condition with a secret and half-conscious pride as a token of superiority. It seems that there are a good many kinds of sensitiveness. Whether it is a good or bad possession depends entirely on what kind of things a person is sensitive to. If he is quick to take in a situation, easily impressed with the needs of others, open-doored to beauty and to the appeal of the spiritual, keenly alive to the humorous, even when the joke is on himself and the situation uncomfortable, then surely he has a right to be glad of his sensitiveness. But too often the word means something else. It means feeling intensely physical sensations of which most people are unaware, or reacting emotionally to situations which call for no such response. It means, in short, feeling our feelings and liking to feel them. There seems to be nothing particularly praiseworthy or desirable about this kind of sensitiveness. If this is what it means to be a finely wrought violin, it might even be better to be a bass drum, which can stand a few poundings without ruin to its constitution. But, says the sensitive person, are we not born either violins or drums? Is not heredity rather than choice to blame? And what can a person do about it? These questions are so closely bound up with the problems of nervous symptoms of indigestion, fatigue, a woman's ills, hysterical pains and sensations, and with all the problems of emotional control, that we shall do well to look more carefully into this question of sensibility, which is really the question of the relation of the individual to his environment. Selecting our sensations, reaction and overreaction. Every organism, if it is to live, must be normally sensitive to its environment. It must possess the power of response to stimuli. As the sea anemone curls up at touch, and as the tiny baby blinks at the light, so must every living thing be able to sense and to react to the presence of a dangerous or a friendly force. Only by a certain degree of irritability can it survive in the struggle for existence. The five senses are simply different phases of the apparatus for receiving communications from the outside world. Other parts of the machinery catch the manifold messages continually pouring into the brain from within our bodies themselves. These communications cannot be stopped, nor can we prevent their impress on the cells of the brain and spinal cord. But we do have a good deal to say as to which ones shall be brought into the focus of attention and receive enough notice to become real, conscious sensations. Paying attention. If a human being had to give conscious attention to every stimulus from the outer world and from his own body, to every signal which flashes itself along his sensory nerves to his brain, he would need a different kind of mind from his present efficient but limited apparatus. As it is, there is an admirable provision for taking care of the messages without overburdening consciousness. The stream of messages never stops, not even in sleep. But the conscious mind has its private secretary, the subconscious, to receive the messages and to answer them. During any 5 minutes of a walk down a city street, a man has hundreds of visual images flashed upon the retina of the eye. His eye sees every little line in the faces of the passers-by, every detail of their clothing, the decorations on the buildings, the street signs overhead, the articles in the shop windows, the paving of the sidewalks, the curbings and tracks which he crosses, and scores of other objects, to most of which the man himself is oblivious. His ear hears every sound within the hearing distance, the honk of every horn, the clang of every bell, the voices of the people and the shuffle of the feet. Some part of his mind feels the press of his foot on the pavement, the rubbing of his heel on his stockings, the touch of his clothing all over his body, and all those so-called kinesthetic sensations of motion and balance which keep him in equilibrium and on the move, to say nothing of the never-ending stream of messages from every cell of every muscle and tissue of his body. Out of this constant rush of stimuli, our man gives attention to only the smallest fraction, whatever is interesting to him that he sees and hears and feels. All other sensations he passes by as indifferent. Unless they come with extraordinary intensity, they do not get over into his consciousness at all. Listening in on the subconscious. The subconscious mind knows and needs to know what is happening in the farthermost cell of the body. It needs to know at any moment where the knees are and the feet. Otherwise the individual would fall in a heap whenever he forgot to watch his step. It needs to know just how much light is entering the eye and how much blood is in the stomach. To this end it has a system of communication from every point in the body, and this system is in constant operation. Its messages never cease. But these messages were never meant to be in the focus of attention. They meant only for the subconscious mind, and are generally so low-toned as to be easily ignored unless one falls into the habit of listening for them. Unless they are invested with a significance which does not belong to them, they will not emerge into consciousness as real sensations. Psychic thresholds. Boris Sidis has given us a word which has proved very useful in this connection. The limit of sensitivity of a cell, the degree of irritability, he calls the stimulus threshold. As the wind must come in gusts to drive the rain in over a high doorsill, so must any stimulus, an idea or a sensation, come with sufficient force to get over the obstructions at the doorway of consciousness. These psychic thresholds do not maintain a constant level. They are raised or lowered at will by a hidden and automatic machinery, which is dependent entirely on the ideas already in consciousness, by the interest bestowed upon the newcomer. The intensity of the stimuli cannot be controlled, but the interest we feel in them and the welcome given them are very largely a matter of choice. Each organism has a wide field of choice as to which ideas and which physical stimuli it shall welcome and which it shall shut out. We may raise our thresholds, build up a bulwark of indifferences to a whole class of excitations, shut our mental doors and pull down the shades, or we may lower the thresholds so that the slightest flicker of an idea or the smallest pinprick of a sensation finds ready access to the centre of attention. Thresholds and character. There are certain thresholds made to shift frequently and easily. When one is hungry, any food tastes good, for the threshold is low. But the food must be most tempting to be acceptable just after a hearty meal. On the other hand, a fairly constant threshold is maintained for many different kinds of stimuli. These stimuli are always bound together in groups and make appeal depending upon the predominating interest. As anything pertaining to agriculture is noticed by a farmer, or any article of dress by a fashionable woman, so any stimulus coming from a warm group is welcomed, while any from a cold group is met by a high threshold. The kind of person one is depends upon what kind of things are warm to him and what kind are cold. The Superman is one who has gained such conscious control of his psychic thresholds that he can raise and lower them at will in the interests of the social good. Thresholds and sensations. The importance of these principles is obvious. The next chapter will show more of their influence on ideas and emotions, but for the present we will consider their lessons in the sphere of the physical. Psychology speaks here in no uncertain terms to physiology. Whoever becomes fascinated by the processes of his own body is bound to magnify the sensations from those processes until the most insignificant message from the subconscious becomes a distressing and alarming symptom. The person whose mental ear is strained to catch every little creaking of his internal machinery can always hear some kind of rumble. If he deliberately lowers his thresholds to the whole class of stimuli pertaining to himself, there is small wonder that they sweep over his boundaries into the consciousness with irresistible force. The motives for sensitiveness. Sensitiveness is largely a matter of choice. But what determines choice? Why is it that one person chooses altruism as the master threshold that determines the level of all others, while another person who ought to be equally fine lowers his thresholds only to himself? What makes a person too interested in his own sensations and feelings? As usual, there is a cause. The real cause back of most cases of chronic sensitiveness is an abnormal desire for attention. Sometimes this love of attention arises from an underdeveloped instinct of self-assertion or inferiority complex. If there is a sense of inadequacy, a feeling of not being so important as other people, a person is quite likely to overcompensate by making himself seem important to himself and to others in the only way he knows. All unconsciously, he develops an extreme sensitiveness which somehow heightens his self-regard by making him believe himself finely and delicately organized and by securing the notice of his associates. Or again, the love of attention may be simply a sign of arrested development, a fixation of the narcissistic period of childhood, which loves to look at itself and make the world look. Or there may be lack of satisfaction of the normal adult love life, a lack of the love and attention which the love instinct naturally craves. If this instinct is not getting normal outlet, either directly through personal relationships or indirectly through a sublimated activity, what is more natural than that it should turn in on itself, dissociate its interest in other things and occupy itself with its own feelings, and at the same time secure the coveted attention through physical disability, with its necessity for special ministration. In any case, there is likely to develop a general overreaction to all outside stimulation, a hypersensitiveness to some particular kind of stimulus, or a chronic hysterical pain which somehow serves the personality in ways unknown to itself. No one feels his feelings unless, despite all discomfort, he really enjoys them. A hard statement to accept, perhaps, but one that is repeatedly proved by a specialist in nerves. Determining causes. Accidental association. In many cases, the form which the sensitiveness takes is merely a matter of accident. Often it is based on some small physical disability, as when a slight tendency to take cold is magnified into an intense fear of fresh air. Sometimes a past fleeting pain which has become associated with the stream of thought of an emotional moment, what Boris Sidis calls the moment consciousness, is perpetuated in consciousness in place of the repressed emotion. In the determination of the pathology of hysteria, the accidental moment plays a much greater part than is generally recognized. If a painful affect, emotion, originates while eating but is suppressed, it may produce nausea and vomiting and continue for months as an hysterical symptom. One of Freud's patients, Miss Rosalie H., found while taking singing lessons that she often choked over notes of the middle register, although she took with ease notes higher and lower in the scale. It was revealed that this girl, who had a most unhappy home life, had during a former period often experienced this choking sensation from a painful emotion just before she went for a music lesson. Some of the leftover sensations had remained during the singing, and as the middle notes happened to involve the same muscles as does a lump in one's throat, she had often found herself choking over these notes. Later on, while living in a different city and in a wholly different environment, the physical sensations from her throat muscles, as they took these middle notes, brought back the associated sensations of choking, without, however, uncovering the buried emotion. Many a painful hysterical affliction is based on just such mechanisms as these. As Freud remarks, the hysteric suffers mostly from reminiscences. Subconscious symbolism. Sometimes, as we have seen, the form which hypersensitiveness assumes is not determined by any physical sensation, either past or symbolism which acts out in the body the drama of the soul. Facing the facts. Whatever the motives and whatever the determining causes, hypersensibility is in any case a feeling of feelings which is not warranted by the present situation. Hypersensitiveness is never anything but a makeshift kind of satisfaction. Despite certain subconscious reasoning, it does not make one more important nor more beloved. Neither does it furnish a real expression for that great creative love instinct, whose outlet, if it is to bring satisfaction, must be a real outlet in the external world. An understanding of the motives is helpful only when it makes clear that they are short-sighted motives, and that the real desires back of them may be satisfied in better ways. Some lowered thresholds. As the public appetite for specific cases appears to be insatiable, we will give from real life some examples of low thresholds, which were raised through re-education. One hesitates to write down these examples because when they are on paper, they sound like advertisements of patent medicines. However, there is no magic in any of these cures, but only the working out of definite laws which may be used by other sufferers if they only know. Re-education through knowledge of oneself and the laws at work really does remarkable things when it has a chance. Danger signals without the danger. There was the man who had queer feelings all over his body, especially in his head and stomach, and who considered these sensations as danger signals warning him to stop. This man had worked up from messenger boy to a position next to the president in one of the transcontinental railroad systems. On the appearance of these danger signals, he had tried to resign, but had been given a year's leave of absence instead. Half the year had gone in rest cure, but he was still afraid to eat or work, and believed himself done for. After 3 weeks of re-education, he saw that, instead of having overdrawn his capital, he had in another sense overdrawn his sensations. He went away as fit as ever, finished his leave of absence doing hard labour on his farm, and then went back to even harder tasks, working for the government in the administration of the railroads during the war. He is still at work. Enjoying poor health. There was the woman who had been an invalid for 20 years, doing little else during all that time than to feel her own feelings. Because of the distressing sensations in her stomach, she had for a year taken nothing but liquid nourishment. She had queer feelings in her solar plexus, and indeed a general luxury of overfeeling. She could not leave her room nor have any visitors. She was the star invalid of the family, waited on by her 2 hard-working sisters who earned the living for them all. Her sisters had inveigled her to my house under false pretenses, calling it a boarding house, and omitting to mention that I was a doctor, because she guessed she knew more about her case than any doctor. For the first week, I got in only 1 sentence a day, just before I slipped out of the door after taking in her liquid nourishment. But at the end of the week, I announced that thereafter her meals would be served in the dining room. When she found that there was to be no more liquid nourishment, she had to appear at the family table. After that, it was only a short time before she was at home cooking for her sisters. When she saw the role she'd been unconsciously playing, she could hardly wish to go on with it. Feeling his legs. Mr. R. suffered from such severe and distressing pains in his legs that he believed himself on the verge of paralysis. He was also bothered by a chronic emotional state which made him look like a weepy woman. His eyes were always full of tears and his chin a quiver, and he had, as he said, a perpetual lump in his throat. Under re-education, both lump and paralysis disappeared completely, and Mr. R. took his wife across the continent, driving his machine with his own hands and feet. A subconscious association. Mr. D's case admirably illustrates the return of symptoms through an unconscious association. He was a lawyer prominent in public affairs of the Middle West, who had been my patient for several weeks, and had gone home cured of many striking disabilities. Before he came to me, he had given up his public work and was believed by all his associates to be afflicted with softening of the brain, and out of the game for good. From being one of the ablest men of his state, he had fallen into such a condition that he could neither read a letter nor write one. He could not stand the least sunshine on his head, and to walk half a mile was an impossibility. He was completely down and out, and expected to be an invalid for the rest of his life. But these symptoms had one by one disappeared during his 5-week stay with me. He had done good stiff work in the garden, carried a heavy sack of grapefruit a mile in the hot sun, and was generally his old self again. Now he was back in the harness, hard at work as of old. Suddenly, as he sat reading in his home one evening, all his old symptoms swept over him. The pains in his head and legs, the pounding of the heart, the all-gone sensations as though he were going to die on the spot. He became almost completely dissociated, but through it all he clung to the idea which he had learned, namely, that this experience was not really physical as it seemed, but was the result of some idea, and would pass. He did not tell anyone of the attack, ignored it as much as possible, and waited. In a few minutes, he was himself again. Then he looked for the cause and realized that the article he was reading was one he had read several months previous, when suffering most severely from the whole train of symptoms. When the familiar words had again gone into his mind, they had pressed the button for the whole physiological experience which had once before been associated with them. This is the same mechanism as that involved in Prince's case. Miss Beauchamp, who became completely dissociated at one time when a breeze swept across her face. When Dr. Prince looked for the cause, he found that once before she had experienced certain distressing emotions while a breeze was fanning her cheek. The recurrence of the physical stimulation had been sufficient to bring back in its entirety the former emotional complex. Another kind of association. One of my women patients illustrates another kind of association mechanism, based not on proximity in time, but proximity of position in the body. This woman had complained for years of bladder trouble. Although no physical examination had been able to reveal any organic difficulty, she referred to a constant distress in the region of the bladder, and was never without a certain red blanket which she wrapped around her every time she sat down. During psychoanalysis, she recounted an experience of years before, which she had never mentioned to anybody. During a professional consultation, her physician, a married man, had suddenly seized her and exclaimed, "I love you, I love you." In spite of herself, the woman felt a certain appeal, followed by a great sense of guilt. In the conflict between physiological reflex and her moral repugnance, she had shunted out of consciousness the real sex sensation and had replaced it with a sensation which had become associated in her subconscious mind with the original temptation. Since the nerves from the genital region and from the bladder connect with the same segment of the spinal cord, she had unconsciously chosen to mix her messages and to cling to the substitute sensation without being in the least conscious of the cause. As soon as she had described the scene to me and had discerned its connection with her symptoms, the bladder trouble disappeared. Afraid of the cold. Patients who are sensitive to cold are very numerous. Mr. G, he of the prunes and brown biscuits, was so afraid of a draught that he could detect the air current if a window was opened a few inches anywhere in a 2-story house. He always wore 2 suits of underwear, but despite his precautions, he had a swollen red throat much of the time. His prescription was a cold bath every morning, a source of delight to the other men patients, who made him stay in the water while they counted 5. He was required to dress and live like other folks, and of course his sensitiveness and his sore throat disappeared. Dr. B, when he came to me, was the most wrapped-up man I had ever met. He had on 2 suits of underwear, a sweater, a vest and suit coat, an overcoat, a bearskin coat, and a Jaeger scarf, all in Pasadena in May. Besides this fear of cold, he was suffering from a hypersensitiveness of several other varieties. So sensitive was his skin that he had his clothes all made several sizes too big for him so that they would not make pressure. He was so aware of the muscles of the neck that he believed himself unable to hold up his head, and either propped it with his hands or leaned it against the back of a chair. He had been working on the 8th edition of his book, a scientific treatise of nationwide importance, but his eyes were so sensitive that he could not possibly use them and had to keep them shaded from the glare. He was so conscious of the messages of fatigue that he was unable to walk at all, and he suffered from the usual trouble with constipation. All these symptoms, of course, belong together, and with the direct result of a wrong state of mind. When he had changed his mind, he took off his extra clothes, walked 1.5 miles at the first try, gave up his constipation, and went back to work. Later on I had a letter from him, saying that his favourite seat was an overturned nail keg in the garden, that he was thinking of sawing the backs off his chairs. Miss Y had worn cotton in her ears for a year or 2 because she had once had an inflammation of the middle ear, and believed the membrane still sensitive to cold. There was Miss E, whose underwear always reached to her throat and wrists, and who spent her time following the sun, and Dr. I, who never forgot her heavy sweater or shawl over her knees, even in front of the fire. The procession of cold ones is almost endless, but always they find that their sensitiveness is of their own making, and that it disappears when they choose to ignore it. Fear of light. Fear of cold is no more common than the fear of light. Nervous folks with half-shut eyes are very frequent indeed. From one woman I took at least 7 pairs of dark glasses before she learned that her eye was made for light. A good example is furnished by a woman who was not a patient of mine at all, but merely the sister of a patient. After my patient had been cured of a number of distressing symptoms, pain in the spine, sore heels, a severe nervous cough, indigestion, and other typical complaints, she began to scheme to get her sister to come to me. The sister, the wife of a minister in the Middle West, had a constant pain in her eyes, compelling her to hold them half shut all the time. When she was approached about coming to me, she said indignantly, "If that doctor thinks that my trouble is nervous, she is much mistaken," and then proceeded to get well. Once the subconscious mind gets the idea that its game is recognized, it is very apt to give up, and it can do this without loss of time if it really wants to. Pain at the base of the brain. Of all nervous pains, that in the back of the neck is by all odds the most common. It is rare indeed to find a nervous patient without this complaint, and among supposedly well folk it is only too frequent. Indeed, it almost seems that in some quarters such a pain stands as a badge of the fervour and zeal of one's work. But work is never responsible for this sense of discomfort. Only an oversensitiveness to feelings or a false emotionalism can produce a pain of this kind, unless it should happen to be caused by some poison circulating in the blood. The trouble is not with the nerves or with the spine, despite the fad about misplaced vertebrae. When a doctor examines a sensitive spine, marking the sore spots with a blue pencil, and a few minutes later repeats the process, he finds almost invariably that the spots have shifted. They are not true physical pains, and they rarely remain long in the same place. Pain in the spine and neck is an example of exaggerated sensibility or over-awareness. Since all messages from every part of trunk and limb must go through the spinal cord, and since very many of them enter the cord in the region of the neck and shoulder blades, it is only natural that an overfeeling of these messages should be especially noticed in this zone. Sometimes a false emotionalism adds to the discomfort by tensing the whole muscular system and making the messages more intense. When a social worker or a businessman gets tense over his work, or ties himself into knots over a committee meeting, he not only foolishly wastes his energy, but makes his nerves carry messages that are more urgent than usual. Then if he is on the lookout for sensations, he all the more easily becomes aware of the central station in the spine where the messages are received. By centering his attention on this station and tightening up his back muscles, he increases this over-awareness and easily gets himself into the clutch of a vicious habit. Sometimes the tenseness of the body is a result not of a false attitude toward one's work, but of a lack of satisfaction in other directions. If the love force is not getting what it wants, it may keep the body in a state of tension with all the undesirable results of such tension. Various pains. Tender spots may appear in most any part of the body. There was the girl with the sore scalp, who was frequently so sensitive that she could not bear to have a single hair touched at its farthermost end, and who could not think of brushing her hair at such a time. There was the man whose wrists and ankles were so painful that the slightest touch was excruciating, the woman with the false sciatica, the man with the so-called appendicitis pains, and the man with the false neuritis, who always wore jersey coats several sizes too large. Each one of these false pains was removed by the process of re-education. Low thresholds to fatigue. Mr. H. was habitually so overcome by fatigue that he could not make himself carry through the slightest piece of work, even when necessity demanded it. On Sunday night, when there was no one else to milk the cow, he had to stop in the middle of the process and go into the house to lie down. To carry the milk was impossible. So low were his thresholds to the slightest message of fatigue. It turned out that things were not going right in reproductive life. His threshold was low in this direction, and it carried down with it all other thresholds. After a general re-evaluation of values, he found himself able to keep his thresholds at the normal level. A fine, efficient missionary from the Orient had been so overcome with fatigue that he was forced to give up all work and return to his country. He had been with me for a while and was again ready to go to work. He came one day with a radiant face to bid me good-bye. "Why are you so joyous?" I asked. "Because," he answered, "before I came home I was so fatigued that it used me up completely just to see the native servants pack our luggage. Now we are taking back twice as much, and I not only packed it all myself, but made the boxes with my own hands. no more fatigue for me. A charming young girl, who in many ways was an inspiration to all her associates, fell into the habit of over-feeling her fatigue. "You know, Doctor," she said, "that I give out too much of myself. Everybody tells me so." That was just the trouble. Everybody had told her so, and the suggestion had worked. It did not take her long to learn that in scattering abroad she was enriching herself, and that her giving out was not exhausting her, but rather the truest kind of self-expression. It is only when a giving out is accompanied by a looking in that it can ever deplete. The "see how much I'm giving, and how tired I shall be" attitude could hardly fail to exhaust. But a real self-expression and the fulfillment of a real desire to give are never anything else than exhilarating. There is something wrong with a minister who is used up after his Sunday sermons. If his message and not himself is a real concern, he will have only a normal amount of fatigue, accompanied by a general sense of accomplishment and well-being, after he has fed his flock. To be sure, I have never been a minister, but I've had a goodly number among my patients, and I speak from a fairly close acquaintance with their problems. Stopping our ears. Roosters seem to be a perpetual source of annoyance to the folk whose thresholds are not under proper control, but as roosters seem to be necessary to an egg-eating nation, it seems simpler to change the threshold than to abolish the roosters. There was one woman who complained especially about being disturbed by early morning chanticleers. I explained that the crowing called for no action on her part, that therefore she should not allow it to come into consciousness. "Do you mean," she said, "that I could keep from hearing them?" As it happened, she was sitting under the clock, which had just struck 7. "Do you hear that clock strike?" I asked. "No," she said. "Did it strike?" This poor little woman, who suffered from a very painful back and other distressing symptoms, had been married at 16 to a roue of 40, and, without experience any of the psychic feelings of sex, had immediately plunged into the physical sex relations. Since sex is psychophysical, and since any attempt to separate the two elements is both desecrating and unsatisfactory, it is not surprising that misery and finally divorce had been her portion. Another equally unpleasant experience had followed, and the poor woman, in the strain and disappointment of her love life, and in the lowering of the thresholds pertaining to this thwarted instinct, had unconsciously lowered the thresholds to all physical stimuli, until she was no longer master of herself in any line. When she saw the reason for her exaggerated reactions, she was able to gain control of herself and to find outlets in other ways. Summary. There are two kinds of people in the world, masters and puppets. There is the man in control of his thresholds, at leisure from himself and master of circumstance, free to use his energy in fruitful ways, and there is the oversensitive soul, wondering where the barometer stands and whether people are going to be quiet, feeling his feelings and worrying because no one else feels them, forever wasting his energy in exaggerated reactions to normal situations. This ticklish person is not better equipped than his neighbour, but more poorly equipped. True adjustment to the environment requires the faculty of putting out from consciousness all stimuli that do not require conscious attention. The nervous person is lacking in this faculty, but he usually fails to realize that this lack places him in the class of defectives. A paralyzed man is a cripple because he cannot run with the crowd. A nervous individual is a cripple, but only because he thinks that to run with the crowd lacks distinction. Something depends on the accident of birth, but far more depends on his own choice. Understanding, judicious neglect of symptoms, whole-souled absorptions in other interests, and a good look in the mirror are sure to put him back in the running with a wholesome delight in being once more like folks. End of chapter 14.
Section 15 of Outwitting Our Nerves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Belinda McReynolds. Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury. In which we learn discrimination, choosing our emotions, liking the taste. It was a summer evening by the seaside, and a group of us were sitting on the porch having a sort of heart-to-heart talk about psychology, which means, of course, that we were talking about ourselves. One by one, the different members of the family spoke out the questions that had been troubling them, or brought up their various problems of character or of health. At length, a splendid Red Cross nurse, who had won medals for distinguished service in the early days of the war, broke out with the question, "Doctor, how can I get rid of my terrible temper? Sometimes it is very bad, and always it has been one of the trials of my life." She spoke earnestly and sincerely, but this was my answer. "You like your temper. Something in you enjoys it, else you would give it up." Her face was a study in astonishment. "I don't like it," she stammered. "Always after I have had an outburst of anger, I'm in the depths of remorse. Many a time I have cried my eyes out over this very thing." "And you like that too," I answered. "You are having an emotional spree, indulging yourself, first in one kind of emotion and then in another. If you really hated it as much as you say you do, you would never allow yourself the indulgence, much less speak of it afterward." Her astonishment was still further increased when several of the group said they too had sensed her satisfaction with her moods. Hard as it is to believe, we do choose our emotions. We like emotion as we do salt in our food, and too often we choose it because something in us likes the savor, and not because it leads to the character or the conduct that we know to be good. The power of choice. Whether we believe it or not, and whether we like it or not, the fact remains that we ourselves decide which of all the possible emotions we shall choose, or we decide not to press the button for any emotion at all. To a very large extent, man, if he knows how and really wishes, may select the emotion which is suitable in that it leads to the right conduct, has a beneficial effect on the body, adapts him to his social environment, and makes him the kind of man he wants to be. The test of feeling. The psychologist today has a sure test of character. He says in substance, "Tell me what you feel, and I will tell you what you are. Tell me what things you love, what things you fear, and what makes you angry, and I will describe with a fair degree of accuracy your character, your conduct, and a good deal about the state of your physical health." Since this test of emotion is fundamentally sound, it is not surprising that the nervous man is in a state of distress. Indigestion, fatigue, oversensibility sound like problems in physiology, but we cannot go far in the discussion of any of them without coming face to face with the emotions as the real factors in the case. When we turn to the mental characteristics of nervous folk, we even more quickly find ourselves in the midst of an emotional disturbance. Worried, fearful, anxious, self-pitying, excitable, or melancholy, the nervous person proves that whatever else a neurosis may be, it is, in essence, a riot of the emotions. There is small wonder that a riot at the heart of the empire should lead to insurrection in every province of the personality. It is only for the purpose of discussion that we can separate feeling from thinking and doing. Every thought and every act has in it something of all three elements. An emotion is not an isolated phenomenon. It is bound up on the one hand with ideas and on the other with bodily states and conduct. Whoever runs amok in his emotions runs amok in his whole being. The nervous invalid, with his exhausted and sensitive body, his upset mind and irrational conduct, is a living illustration of the central place of the emotions in the realm of the personality. But it is not the nervous person only who needs a better understanding of his emotional life. The well man also gets angry for childish reasons. He is prejudiced and envious, unhappy and suspicious for the very same reason as is the nervous man. Since the working capital of energy is limited to a definite amount, the control of the emotions becomes a central problem in any life, a deciding factor in the output and the outcome, as well as in comfort and happiness by the way. Nothing is harder for the average man to believe than this fact that he really has the power to choose his emotions. He has been dissatisfied with himself in his past reactions, and yet he has not known how to change them. His anger or his depression has appeared so undesirable to his best judgment and to his conscious reason that it has seemed to be not a part of himself at all, but an invasion from without which has swept over him without his consent and quite beyond control. A house divided against itself. Most of the confusion comes from the fact that we know only a part of ourselves. What we do not consciously enjoy, we believe we do not enjoy at all. What we do not consciously choose, we believe to be beyond our power of choice. The work of the evil one, or the natural depravity of human nature, perhaps, but certainly not anything of our choosing. The point is that a human being is so constituted that he can, without knowing it, entertain at the same time two diametrically opposite desires. The average person is not so unified as he believes, but is, in fact, a house divided against itself. The words of the Apostle Paul express for most of us the truth about ourselves. For what I would, that I do not, but what I hate, that I do. What Paul calls the law of his members warring against the law of his mind is simply what we call today the instinctive desires coming into conflict with our conscious ideal. Hidden desires. Although we choose our emotions, we choose in many cases in response to a buried part of ourselves of what we are wholly unaware or only half aware. When we do not like what we have chosen, it is because the conscious part of us is out of harmony with another part, and that part is doing the choosing. If the emotions which we choose are not those that the whole of us, or at least the conscious, would desire, it is because we are choosing in response to hidden desires and giving satisfaction to cravings which we have not recognized. Repeated indulgence of such desires is responsible for the emotional habits which we are too likely to consider an inevitable part of our personality, inherited from ancestors who were not on hand to defend themselves. When we form the habit of being afraid of things that other people do not fear, or of being irritated or depressed, or of giving way to fits of temper, it is because these habit reactions satisfy the inner cravings that in the circumstances can get satisfaction in no better way. These hidden desires are of several different kinds when squarely looked at. Some of the cravings are found to be childish, and so out of keeping with our real characters that we could not possibly hold on to them as conscious desires. Others turn out to be so natural and so inevitable that we wonder how we could ever have imagined that they ought to be repressed. Still others, legitimate in themselves, but denied because of outer circumstances, are found to be easily satisfied in indirect ways which bear no resemblance to their old unfortunate forms of outlet. When knowledge helps. The way to get rid of an undesirable emotion is not by working up the emotion itself, but by realizing that this is merely an offshoot of a deeper root, hidden below the surface. The great point is to recognize this deeper root. Childish anger. It helps to know that uncalled for anger is a defense reaction, a sort of camouflage or smoke cloud which we throw out to hide from ourselves and others the fact that we are being worsted in an argument or being shown up in an undesirable light. Better than any amount of weeping over a hot temper is an understanding of the fact that when we fly into unseemly rage, we are usually giving indulgence to a childhood desire to run away from unpleasant facts and to cover up our own faults. Enjoying the blues. It helps to know that the easiest way to fight the blues is by realizing that they are a deliberate, if unconscious, attempt to gain the pity of ourselves and others. There seems to be in undeveloped human nature something that really enjoys being pitied, and if we cannot get the commiseration of other people, we can, without much trouble, work up a case of self-pity. Most of us would have to acknowledge that we seldom find tears in our eyes except when our own woes are under consideration. Whatever else the blues accomplish, They certainly afford us a chance to submerge ourselves in a sea of self-engrossment. The chip on the shoulder. It helps to know that irritability and oversensitiveness are usually the result of tension from unsatisfied desires which must find some kind of outlet. If a person is secretly restive under the fact that he cannot have the kind of clothes he wants, cannot shine in society, or secure a college education or a large fortune, all of which minister to our insistent and rarely satisfied instinct of self-assertion, or if he is secretly yearning for the satisfaction of the marriage relation, or for the sense of completion in parenthood, then the tension from these unsatisfied desires shows itself in 100 little everyday instances of lack of self-control. These mystify him and his friends, but they are understandable when the whole truth is known. Anxiety and fear. Nowhere is understanding more valuable than when we approach the subject of anxiety and fear. Whenever a person falls into a state of abnormal fear, his friends and his physician spend a good deal of time in attempting to prove to him that there is no cause for apprehension, and in exhorting him to use his reason and give up his fear. But how can a person help himself when he is fighting in the dark? How can he free himself when the thing he thinks he fears is merely a symbol of what he really fears? The woman who was afraid she would choke her child had been several months in the hands of Christian Scientists and had earnestly tried to replace fear with courage. But in the circumstances, and without further knowledge, this was as impossible as it is for a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps. She had no point of contact with her real fear, as the man has no leverage contact with the earth from which he wishes to lift himself. To be sure, there are many cases in which an assumed cheerfulness and courage do have a mighty effect on the inner man. The forces of the personality are not set, but plastic, and are constantly acting and interacting upon one another. Surface habits do influence the forces below the surface. William James' advice, square your shoulders, speak in a major key, smile and turn a compliment, is good for most occasions, but sometimes even a little understanding of the cause is far more effective. It helps to know that persistent anxiety, lacking obvious cause, is found to be the anxiety of the thwarted instinct of reproduction. When the sex instinct is repeatedly stimulated and then checked, it sets in motion some of the same glands that are activated in fear. What comes up into consciousness is therefore very naturally a fear or dread of impending disaster, very like the poignant anxiety that one feels when stepping up in the dark to a step that is not there. Simultaneous with the fear lest these repressed desires should not be satisfied, there is an intense fear lest they should. The more insistent the repressed desire, and the more it seems likely to break through into consciousness, the keener the anguish of the ethical impulses. Abnormal fear, however it may seem to be externalized, always implies at the bottom a fear of something within. There is no truth which is harder to believe on first hearing, but which grows more compelling with further knowledge, than this truth that an exaggerated fear always implies a desire which somehow offends the total personality. When we observe the various distressing phobias, such as the common fear of contamination, a woman's fear to undress at night, a fear that the gas was not turned off, or that one's clothing is out of order, fear lest the exact truth has not been told, or that the uttermost farthing of one's obligations has not been met, then we may know that there is something in the fear situation which either directly or symbolically refers to some hidden desire, a desire which the individual would not for the world acknowledge to himself, but which is too keen to be altogether repressed. The close connection between fear and desire is often shown in the unfounded fear of having committed a crime. Both doctors and lawyers in their professional work occasionally come upon individuals who believe that they have committed some heinous crime of which they are really innocent, and who insist upon their guilt despite all evidence to the contrary. A quiet, gentle youth who at the age of 20 was under my medical care is still not sure in his own whether he, at 12 years of age, was the burglar who broke into the village store and killed the owner. It is difficult for the normally self-satisfied individual to understand the appeal of heroics to a person whose starved instinct of self-assertion makes him choose to be known as a villain rather than not to be known at all. Breaking the spell. When once we bring up into consciousness these hidden desires that manifest themselves in such troublesome ways, we find that we have robbed them of much of their power over our lives. Sometimes, it is true, a detailed and thorough exploration by psychoanalysis is necessary, but in many cases it is sufficient just to know that there are underlying causes. To know these things is far from excusing ourselves because of them. Even though emotions are determined by forces that are deep in the subconscious, we may still choose in opposition to those forces if we but know that we can do so. The fact that some of the roots of our bad habits reach down into the subconscious is no excuse for not digging them up. As Dr. Putnam says, it is the whole of us that acts, and we are as responsible for the supervision of the unseen as for the obvious factors that are at work. The moon may be only half illumined and half visible, but the invisible half goes on, nonetheless, exerting its full share of influence on the motion of the tides and earth. The highest kind of choice. There is no easier way to enliven any conversation than by dropping the remark that a human being always does what he wants to do. Simple as the statement seems, it is quite enough to quicken the dullest table talk and loosen the most reticent tongue. "I don't do what I want to do," says the college student. "I want to play tennis every afternoon, but what I do is to sit in a stuffy room and study." "I don't do what I want to do," says the mother of a family. "At night, I want to sit down and read the latest magazine, but what I do is to darn stockings by the hour." Nevertheless, we shall see that, even in cases like these, each of us is acting in accordance with his strongest desire. There may be, there often is, a bitter conflict, but in the end, the desire that is really stronger always conquers and works itself out into action. It is possible to imagine a situation in which a man would be physically unable to do what he wanted to do. Bound by physical cords, held by prison walls, or weakened by illness, he might be actually unable to carry out his desires. But apart from physical restraint, it is hard to imagine a situation in real life in which a person does not actually do what he wants to do. That is, what in the circumstances he wants to do. This is simply saying in another way that we act in accordance with the emotion which is at the moment strongest. Will is choice. Just here we can imagine an earnest protest. But why do you ignore the human will? Why do you try to make man the creature of feeling? A high-grade man does not what he wants to do, but what he thinks he ought to do. In any person worthy of the adjective civilized, it is conscience, not desire, which is the motive power of his life. It is true, in the better kind of man, the will is of central importance. But what is will? Let us imagine a raw soldier in the trenches just before a charge into no man's land. He is afraid, but the word of command comes, and instantly he is a new creature. His fear drops away, and, energized by the lust of battle, he rushes forward, obviously driven by the stronger emotion. He goes ahead because he really wants to, and we say that he does not have to use his will. Imagine another soldier in the same situation. With him, fear seems uppermost. His knees shake and his legs want to carry him in the wrong direction, but he still goes forward. And he goes forward, not so much because there is no other possibility, as because, in the circumstances, he really wants to. All his life, and especially during his military training, he has been filled with ideals of loyalty and courage. More than he fears the guns of the enemy or of his firing squad, does he fear the loss of his own self-respect and the respect of his comrades. Greater than his will to live is his desire to play the man. There is conflict, and the desire which seems at the moment weaker is given the victory because it is reinforced by that other permanent desire to be a worthy man, brave and dependable in a crisis. He goes forward because in the circumstances he really wants to, but in this case we say that he had to use his will. Is it not apparent that will itself is choice, the selection by the whole personality of the emotion and the action which best fits into its ideals? Will is choice by the part of us which has ideals. McDougall points out that will is the reinforcement of the weaker desire by the master desire to be a certain kind of character. Each human being, as he goes through life, acquires a number of moral ideals and sentiments which he adopts as his own. They become linked with the instinct of self-assertion, which henceforth acts as the motive power behind them, and attempts to drive from the field any emotion which happens to conflict. Men, like the lower animals, are ruled by desire. But, as G.A. Coe says, men mold themselves. They form desires not merely to have this or that object, but to be this or that kind of man. If a man be worthy of the name, he is not swayed by the emotion which happens for the moment to be strongest. He has the power to reinforce and make dominant those impulses which fit into the ideal he has built for himself. In other words, he has the power to choose between his desires, and this power depends largely upon the ideals which he has incorporated into his life by the complexes and sentiments which compose his personality. Ideas and ideals. If emotion is the heart of humanity, ideas are its head. In our emphasis on emotion, we must not forget that as emotion controls action, so ideas control emotion. But ideas of themselves are not enough. Everybody has seen weaklings who are full of pious platitudes. Ideas do control life, but only when linked up with some strong emotion. No moral sentiment is strong enough to withstand an intense instinctive desire. If ideas are to be dynamic factors in a life, they must become ideals and be really desired. They must be backed up by the impulse of self-assertion, incorporated with the sentiment of self-regard, and so made a permanent part of the central personality. Parents and teachers who try to break a child's will and to punish every evidence of independence and self-assertion little know that they are undermining the foundations of morality itself, and doing their utmost to leave the child at the mercy of his chance whims and emotions. There can be no strength of character without self-regard, and self-regard is built on the instinctive desire of self-assertion. Education and religion. It is easy to see how important education is in this process of giving the right content to the self-regarding sentiment. The child trained to regard temper as a disgrace, self-pity as a vice, oversensitiveness as a sign of selfishness, and all forms of exaggerated emotionalism as a token of weakness, has acquired a powerful weapon against temptation in later life. Indulgence in any of these forms of gratification he will regard as unworthy and out of keeping with his personality. It is easy, too, to see how central a place a vital religious faith has in enriching and ennobling the ego ideal, and in giving it driving power. A force which makes a high ideal seem both imperative and possible of achievement could hardly fail to be a deciding factor. Every student of human nature knows in how many countless lives the Christian religion has made all the difference between mere good intentions and the power to realize those intentions. How many times it has furnished the motive power which nothing else seemed able to supply. Moral sentiments which have been merely sentiments become, through the magic of a new faith, incorporated into conscience and endowed with new power. Just here lies the value of any great love or any intense devotion to a cause. As Royce says, To have a conscience, then, is to have a cause, to unify your life by means of an ideal determined by this cause, and to compare this ideal and the life. Avoiding the strain. It seems that a human being is to a large extent controlled by will, and that will is in itself the highest kind of choice. But too often will is crippled because it does not speak for the whole personality. Knowledge helps a person to relate conscience with hitherto hidden parts of himself, to assert his will, and to choose only those emotions and outlets which the connected up, the unified personality wants. Sometimes, indeed, a little knowledge makes the exercise of the willpower unnecessary. Using willpower is, after all, likely to be a strenuous business. It implies the presence of conflict and the strain of defeating the desire which has to be denied. Why struggle to subdue emotional bad habits when a little insight dispels the desire back of them and makes them melt away as if by magic? For example, why use our will to keep down fear or anger when a little understanding dissipates these emotions without effort? Whatever we do with difficulty, we are not doing well. When it requires effort to do our duty, this means that a great part of us does not want to do it. When we get rid of our hidden resistances, we work with ease. As a strong wind, applied in the right way, drives the ship without effort, just so the forces in our lives, if they are adjusted to one another, will without strain or stress easily and naturally work together to carry us in the direction we have chosen. When we get rid of blind conflicts, even the business of ruling our spirits becomes feasible. Summary. Various sprees. The human animal has a constitutional dislike for dullness and will seize upon almost any device which promises to lift him out of what he considers the monotony of daily grind. An elaborate essay might be written on the means which human beings have taken to create the sense of aliveness which they so much crave. Some of them, we call them savages, have found satisfactory certain wild orgies in primitive war dances. Others, we shall soon call them out of date, have found simpler a bottle of whiskey or a glass of champagne. Still others find a cold shower more invigorating, or a brisk walk, or a good stiff job which sets them aglow with the sense of accomplishment. But there are always those who, for one reason or another, find most satisfactory of all a chronic emotional tippling, or a good old-fashioned emotional spree. Persons who would be shocked at the idea of whiskey or champagne allow themselves this other kind of indulgence without in the least knowing why. Nor is the connection between alcoholism and emotionalism so far-fetched as it seems. Psychoanalytic investigations have repeatedly revealed the fact that both are indulged in because they remove inhibitions, give vent to repressed desires, and bring a sense of life and power which has somehow been lost in the normal living. Both kinds of spree are followed by the inevitable morning after, with its proverbial headache, remorse, and vows of repentance. But despite all this, both are clung to because the satisfaction that brings is too deep to be easily relinquished. Whenever an emotion quite out of keeping with conscious desire is allowed to become habitual, we may know that it is being chosen by a part of the personality which needs to be uncovered and squarely faced. Nervous symptoms and exaggerated emotionalism are alike evidence of the fact that the wrong part of us is doing the choosing and that the will needs to be enlightened on what is taking place in the outer edge of its domain. In the choice between emotionalism and equanimity, the selection of the former can only be in response to unrecognized desire. A nervous person is invariably an emotional person, and as a rule lays the blame for his condition upon past experiences. But experience is what happens to us plus the way we take it. We cannot always ward off the blow, but we can decide upon our reaction. Even if the conduct of others has been the cause of our emotion, it is really we ourselves who have created it by the way in which we have reacted. One ship drives east, another drives west, while the self-same breezes blow. 'Tis the set of the sail, and not the gale, that bids them where to go. Like the winds of the sea are the ways of fate, as we journey along through life. 'Tis the set of the soul that decides the goal, and not the calm or the strife. Rebecca R. Williams. End of section 15.
Section 16 of Outwitting Our Nerves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury. Chapter 16. Glossary and Bibliography. Chapter 16, in which we find new use for our steam. Finding vent in sublimation, the redirection of energy. A child pent up on a rainy day is a troublesome child. His energy keeps piling up, but there is no opportunity for him to expend it. The nervous person is just such a pent-up child. A portion of his personality is developing steam which goes astray in its search for vent. This portion is found to be the psychic side of his sex life. Something has blocked the satisfactory achievement of instinctive ends and turned his interest in on himself. Perhaps he does not come into complete psychic satisfaction of his love life because his wife is out of sympathy or is held back by her own childish repressions. Perhaps his love instinct is baffled by finding itself thwarted in its purpose of creating children, restrained by the social ban and the desire for a luxurious standard of living. Perhaps he is jealous of his chief or of an older relative whose business stride he cannot equal. Jung has pointed out how frequently introversion, or turning in of the life force, is brought about by the painfulness of present reality, and by the lack of the power of adaptation to things as they are. But this lack always has its roots in childhood. The woman who is shocked at the thought of sex is the little girl who reacted too strongly to early impressions. The man of 40 who is disgruntled because he is not made manager of a business created by others is the little boy who was jealous of his father and wanted to usurp his place of power. The man who suffers from a sense of inferiority because his friend has a handsomer or more intellectual wife is the same little boy who strove with his father for possession of the mother, the most desired object in his childish environment. The measure of escape from these childish attitudes means the measure of success in life. Fortunately for society, the average person achieves this success. The normal person in his childhood learned how to switch the energy of his primitive desires into channels approved by society. Stored away in his subconscious, this acquired faculty carries him without conscious effort through all the necessary adjustments in maturity. The nervous person, less well equipped in childhood, may fortunately acquire the faculty in all its completeness, although at the cost of genuine effort and patient self-study. Sublimation, the key word. In the prevention and in the cure of nervous disorders, there is one factor of central importance, and that factor is sublimation, or the freeing of sex energy for socially useful, non-sexual ends. To sublimate is to find vent for oneself and to serve society as well, for sublimation opens up new channels for pent-up energy, utilizing all the surplus of the sex instinct in substitute activities. When the dynamic of this impulse is turned outward, not inward, it proves to be one of man's greatest possessions, a valuable contribution of energy to creative activities and personal relationships of every kind. The failure to sublimate. A neurosis is non-constructive use of one's surplus steam. The trouble with a nervous person is that his love force is turned in on himself instead of out into the world of reality. This is what his friends mean when they say that he is self-absorbed, and this is what the psychologists mean when they say that a neurotic is introverted. A person, in so far as he is nervous, does not see other people at all. That is, he does not see them as real persons, but only as auditors who may be made to listen to the tale of his woes. His own problems loom so large that he becomes especially afflicted with what Cabot calls the sin of impersonality. Or to use President King's words, he lacks that reverence for personality which enables one to see people vividly as real persons and not as streetcar conductors or servants or merely as members of one's family. To be sure, many a so-called normal individual is afflicted with this same kind of blindness. Here, as elsewhere, the neurotic simply exaggerates. Engrossed in his own mental conflicts and physical symptoms, he is likely to find his interest withdrawing more and more from other people and centering upon himself. Sublimation and religion. We do not need psychology to tell us that engrossment in self is a disastrous condition. When the psychoanalyst says that the life force must be turned out, not in, he is approaching from a new angle the truth as it is found in the gospel. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and thy neighbor as thyself. Religion provides the love object in the Creator. Altruism provides it in the neighbor. Christianity and psychology agree that as soon as love ceases to be an outgoing force, just so soon does the individual become an incomplete and disrupted personality. Note: for emphasis on religion as a means to sublimation, see Freud, Putnam, Pfister, James, and Dubois. Carlyle's doctrine of work. Produce, produce, produce. Life for a social being involves not only rich personal relationships, but absorbing creative work. No nervous person is cured until he is willing to take and keep a man-sized job. A good piece of work is not only the sign of a cure, it is the final step without which no cure is complete. Along nature's lines. If the psychologist is asked what kind of task this is to be, he answers that each person must decide for himself his own life work. An individual may not know why, but he does know that there are certain things which he most likes to do. Sublimation is more readily accomplished if his energy is directed towards self-chosen interests. Parents or teachers or physicians who try to force another person into any definite plan of action are making a grievous blunder. Help may be given towards self-knowledge and the understanding of general principles, but advice should never be specific. Taken in the large, it is found that men and women choose different ways of sublimation. Man and woman differ in the psychic components of the sex life, even as they differ in the physical. Sublimation, to be successful, must follow the lines laid down by nature. The urge of the average man is towards construction, domination, mastery. The urge of the average woman is toward mothering, protection, nurture. The masculine characteristics find ready sublimation in a career. The man builds bridges, digs canals, harnesses mountain streams, conquers pests, overcomes gravity, brings the ends of the earth together by wireless or by rail. He provides for the weak and the helpless, his own progeny, or, incarnated in the body of a Hoover, he gives life to the children of the world. In woman, the dominant force is the nurturing instinct. Child and man of her own come first, but when these are lacking, to paraphrase Kipling, in default of closer ties, she is wedded to convictions. Heaven help him who denies. Only as a career opens up full vent for this nurturing instinct will it provide satisfactory substitute in sublimation. Its natural trend can be seen in the recent tidal wave of social legislation for prohibition, child labor laws, sanitation, recognition, and control of venereal disease, acknowledgement of paternity to the illegitimate child. Since the women of the day, in numbers up to the million, have been compelled to sacrifice both man and unformed babe to the grim juggernaut of war, this nurturing urge may press hard against many of the social and business barriers now impeding its flow. But if society understands and readjusts these barriers, making it possible for its citizens, women as well as men, to approximate the natural instinctive bent, It will not only save itself much unrest, but will also go far toward preventing the spread of nervous invalidism. Summary. That which a nervous invalid most needs is a redirection of energy. Since, in spite of appearances, there is never any real lack of energy, no time is needed for the making of strength, and a cure can take place just as soon as the inner forces allow the energy to flow out in the right direction. Sometimes, indeed, an outer change may start the inner process. Often the work cure does cure. Occasionally, the sudden necessity to earn one's living or to mother a little child frees the life force from its old preoccupation and forces it into other channels. In most cases, however, the nervous invalid is suffering not from lack of opportunities for outside interest, but from an inner inability to meet the opportunities which present themselves. The great change that has to be made is not in external conditions and habits, but in the hidden corners of the mind, a change that can be accomplished only by self-knowledge and re-education. But if self-knowledge is the first step in any cure, so self-giving must be the final step. Sooner or later in the life of every nervous invalid, there comes a time when nothing will serve to unify his disorganized forces but steady and unswerving responsibility for a good, stiff piece of work. Happy for him that this is so, and that he is living in a day when science no longer tells him to fold his hands and wait. Glossary. Autonomic nervous system. The vegetative nervous system which controls vital functions as digestion, respiration, circulation. Censor. A hypothetical faculty of the foreconscious mind which resists the emergence into consciousness of questionable desires. Common path. In physiology, the final route over which response is made to physical stimulation. Similarly, in psychology, the one outlet for the finally dominant impulse. Compensation. Exaggerated manifestation of one character trend as a defense against its opposite, which is painfully repressed. Relief in substitute symptom formation. Complex. A group of ideas held together by emotion, usually referring to a group which is wholly or in part unconscious. Compulsion. A persistent compelling impulse to perform some seemingly unreasonable but really substitute or symbolic act, or to hold some irrational fear or idea, an emotional force which has been separated from the original idea. Conflict. Special. Struggle between instincts. Unconscious. Conversion. Special. The process by which a repressed mental complex expresses itself through a physical symptom. Displacement. 1. Transposition of an emotion from its original idea to one more acceptable to the personality. 2. The shifting of emphasis in dreams from essential to less significant elements. Dissociation. 1. The state of being shut out from taking active part, applied to a group of ideas, as in normal forgetfulness. 2. Abnormal. An exaggerated degree of separation of groups of ideas, with loss to the personality of the forces or memories which these groups contain, as in double personality. Fixation. Establishment in childhood of overstrong habit reactions. Free association. A device for uncovering buried complexes by letting the mind wander without conscious direction. Homosexual. The quality of being more attracted by an individual of the same sex, abnormal, than by one of the opposite sex, heterosexual, normal. Hysteria. That form of functional nervous disorder which manifests itself in physical symptoms, an attempt to dramatize unconscious, repressed desires. Inhibition. Restraint, special, limitation of function, physical or ideational, due to unconscious emotional attitudes. Libido, life force, élan vital, or restricted, the energy of the sex instinct. Neurosis, used loosely for psychoneurosis or nervous disorder. Obsession, a compulsive idea inaccessible to reason. Oedipus complex, overstrong bond between mother and son, or, more loosely, between father and daughter. Over-determined, used of an impulse made overstrong by lack of discharge, with accumulation of emotional tension from added factors. Phobia, a persistent, unreasoning fear of some object or situation. Psychoneurosis, a perversion of normal psychic reactions. Prince, a general term for functional dissociation of the personality, resulting in psychasthenia, disturbed ideation, neurasthenia, disturbed emotions, hysteria, disturbed motor or sensory activity. Psychotherapy, treatment by psychic or mental measures. Rationalization, the process of substituting a plausible false explanation for a repressed unconscious desire. Repression, expulsion from consciousness of a pain-provoking mental process. Resistance, the force which impedes the return of a repressed complex to consciousness. Subconscious, that part of the mind of which one is unaware, the storehouse of memories ancestral and personal. Sublimation, the act of freeing sex energy from definitely sexual aims, utilization of sex energy for non-sexual ends. Suggestion, the process by which any idea, true or false, takes hold of one. The idea may enter the mind consciously or unconsciously through reason or through impulse. Symbol, an object or an attitude which stands for an idea or a quality. Special, that which stands for or represents some unconscious mental process. Threshold, door sill, a figure which represents the level of the barrier erected by the mind against the perception of an idea or sensation. Transference, unconscious identification of a present personal relationship with an earlier one, with conveyance of the earlier emotional attitudes, hostile or affectionate, to the present relationship. Bibliography, books on the general laws of body and mind. Cannon, Walter B., Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage. Kreil, George W., The Origin and Nature of the Emotions. Coe, George Albert, The Psychology of Religion. Hudson, Thomas J., The Law of Psychic Phenomena. Janet, Pierre, The Major Symptoms of Hysteria, the Mental State of Hystericals. James, William, Psychology, Talks to Teachers on Psychology, Varieties of Religious Experience. Jastrow, Joseph, The Subconscious. Kempf, Edward J., The Tonus of Autonomic Segments in Psychopathology. Long, Constance, Psychology of Fantasy. McDougall, William, Social Psychology. Mosher, Clelia Duell, Health and the Woman Movement. Phillips, D.E., Elementary Psychology. Prince, Morton, The Unconscious, The Dissociation of a Personality, My Life as a Dissociated Personality. Sherrington, Charles L., The Integrative Action of the Nervous System. Sidis, Boris, The Foundations of Normal and Abnormal Psychology, Psychopathological Researches. Tansley, A.G., The New Psychology. Thompson, William Hanna, Brain and Personality. White, William A., Principles of Mental Hygiene, The Mental Hygiene of Childhood. Proceedings of the International Conference of Women Physicians, National Board, YWCA, 600 Lexington Avenue, New York City. Books on Mental Hygiene. Brown, Charles R., Faith and Health. Bruce, H. Addington, Scientific Mental Healing. Cabot, Richard, What Men Live By, Social Service and the Art of Healing. Dubois, Paul, The Psychic Treatment of Nervous Disorders. Huckel, Oliver, Mental Medicine. James, William, Vital Reserves. Prince, Morton, and others, Psychotherapeutics. Sadler, William S., The Physiology of Faith and Fear. Worcester, Elwood, Macomb, Samuel, Coriat, Isidore H., Religion and Medicine. Books on Psychoanalysis. Brill, A.A., Fundamentals of Psychoanalysis. Emerson, L.E., Nervousness. Freud, Sigmund, The Interpretation of Dreams, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, Wit and the Unconscious, Selected Papers and Sexual Theory, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis. Frink, H.W., Morbid Fears and Compulsions. Hitchman, E., Freud's Theories of the Neuroses. Holt, E.B., The Freudian Wish. Jung, Carl G., The Psychology of the Unconscious, Analytical Psychology. Jones, Ernest, Psychoanalysis, Treatment of the Neuroses, including Psychoneuroses, in Modern Treatment of Nervous and Mental Diseases, White and Jelliffe. Pfister, Oscar, The Psychoanalytic Method. Putnam, James Jackson, Addresses on Psychoanalysis, Human Motives. Tridon, Andre, Psychoanalysis. White, William A., The Mechanisms of Character Formation. Journals devoted to the subject of nervous disorders. Journal of Abnormal Psychology, published in Boston. Psychoanalytic Review, published in Washington, D.C. International Journal of Psychoanalysis, published in London. End of section 16. End of Outwitting Our Nerves by Josephine A. Jackson and Helen M. Salisbury.